Hello, everyone. We're going to wait a couple more minutes to allow more people to join us. We'll be starting momentarily. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope that everyone had a lovely lunch break. My name is Blanca Serrano, and I am Project Director at ISLAA, the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art, which supports this two-day conference and has also co-published the publication accompanying this exhibition and has loaned a number of key artworks to the show. It is my pleasure to introduce and to moderate the third panel of this two-day conference titled Networks, Networks and Communities Around Video and Television. Our discussant today is Chilean, who is Assistant Professor of Art History in the School of Arts and Design at San Diego State University, where she is the Area Coordinator for Art History and an Associated Faculty Member in the Venner Stiefel Center for Brazilian Studies. Her current book project in progress focuses on issues around gender and sexuality in Brazilian performance from camera during the period of the Brazilian military dictatorship of the 1970s through the 1980s. She is also an independent curator and contributes regularly to several contemporary art publications. Her recent and upcoming projects include a virtual exhibition of contemporary Brazilian collage art on the website Digital Brazil, and the forthcoming co-edited volume, The Letter of Rosemary and Bernadette Meyer, 1976-1980, published by the Swiss Institute to be released in June. I'm now going to introduce the panelists. Our first panelist today will be Annie Akmanik, who is a PhD candidate in art history at Columbia University. Her writings have appeared in several art magazines, journals, and exhibition catalogs, including MoMA and the Albright Knox Art Gallery. And she's a former curatorial assistant at MoMA and former associate editor of Art Forum and co-editor of the recent October Files volume on Donald Judd, published by the MIT Press. Our second speaker today is Daniel Quiles, who is an art critic as well as an associate professor of art history, theory, and criticism at the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago. His academic research has focused on Argentinian conceptualism, as well as broader questions related to new media and politics in Latin American art. He received his PhD from the City of New York Graduate Center in 2010. He was a 2003 to 2004 Critical Studies Fellow in the Whitney Independent Study Program, and he received a 2013 Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant and was a 2013-14 Atlas Postdoctoral Fellow at the Conor Superior in Paris. At the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, he teaches courses on the theory and history of post-war art of the Americas. His research has appeared in academic journals such as the Art Journal, Art Margins, and Kayana Magazine. And finally, last but not least, our third speaker today in panel 3 of the This Must Be the Place conference is Jessica Gordon-Burroughs, who is a lecturer, assistant professor in Latin American Studies and Visual Culture at the University of Edinburgh. Her manuscript in preparation is titled Foreign Elements, Latin American Cinematic Experiments in Displacement, and her essays have appeared in several international journals and publications. She was recently awarded the 2021 Best Essay in Latin American Visual Culture Studies by the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, for the Pixelated Afterlife of Nicolás Guillén Landrian, Migratory Forms, published by the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. Thank you so much for joining the second day of the This Must Be the Place conference and panel 3, titled Networks and Communities Around Video and Television. Thank you, enjoy.
Thank you. Share my slides. Oops. One moment. Right. So thank you very much, and really happy to be included in this conference. And it's been very helpful for me to think about some of the research I've been doing in the context of AMA's exhibition. The starting point for my paper is Eduardo Costa's Names of Friends. I'm going to play just a brief clip from this 2-minute film. And this was shown as a video transfer in the first room of part 1 of This Must Be the Place. So the 2-minute long silent film, Names of Friends from 1969, shows the lower half of the artist Eduardo Costa's face as he's speaking a list of words in a serial one thing after another presentation that's in keeping with the era's conceptual and minimal aesthetics. Viewers who can read lips can translate this visual vocabulary of movements, and that is what Costa referred to when he subtitled this piece Poem for the Deaf Mute, although that is an admittedly outdated term now for the deaf or hard of hearing. Both personal and impersonal at once, the film echoes the push and pull that's involved in writing or speaking a language understood as a pre-existing sign system through which we express or identify ourselves. The title informs us that he's listing the names of his friends. These plot a network that includes some Latin American artists such as Rubens Gertschmann and Elio Oiticica, and other friends like those you see here from a crowd of poets, writers, and artists involved with poetry events, a conceptualist genre that's largely been left out of the official art histories of this period. And one of the key instigators of that genre is actually behind the camera in Names of Friends, the American artist and poet Hannah Weiner, who you see here, and this is Eduardo Costa here. Here's Hannah as well, and this press is related to a Central Park poetry events series that I'll speak about later in the talk. So according to Costa, Weiner offered to film Names of Friends for him in her loft on East 3rd Street, and they did so together, having fun, is what he said. With these two artists' dialogic approach in mind, today I'll discuss some of Costa's work from the time he spent in New York in the 1960s alongside that of his friend Hannah Weiner and their circle. Costa had arrived in New York in early 1968 on the heels of his fashion fiction appearing in American Vogue. This wasn't his first trip to New York City, so he'd come from Buenos Aires in 1966 for 3 months and then for 1 month in 67, but this time he would stay for a few years, returning to Buenos Aires in 1971. This fashion fashion fiction, which was a gold cast of an ear that was not really viable or wearable at the time that he brought it to Vogue, continued the type of mass media art works that he'd been doing with Raul Escari, Roberto Jacobi, and Oscar Mazzotta. So the Arte de los Medios, or mass media artworks they were doing, sought to enter into circuits of information dissemination, revealing the power of media to generate reality and bringing art also to a mass audience. My co-panelist, Daniel Quiles, has written on the politicized nature of their infiltrating mass media in Argentina at a time when the media had turned right-wing in support of the military coups in the mid-60s. And there's a lot to be said about that period of Costa's work and his artistic formation in Buenos Aires, but I'll just highlight for my purposes today that Costa was a literary thinker. He translated and published French theory, structuralist text, and he was a student also of Jorge Luis Borges, hence the fiction aspect of this fictional jewelry piece, in which a kind of simulacral creation, once it appears in the pages of a magazine, then starts to become more and more real. So once he moved to New York, Costa quickly became involved with the scene surrounding poetry events. He showed slides and photographs of his fashion fiction in the evening called Tiny Events, which you see a flyer for here, organized by Hannah Wiener in November 1968, in which 21 people did 2-minute long acts ranging from Peter Sheldall shaving himself to Anne Waldman and Louis Warsh pretending to be in bed watching TV and smoking a joint. These were a cross between performance, conceptual art, expanded poetry readings, and social gatherings. So as much poetry reading leaving the podium as art leaving the pedestal, or any number of ways that we designate the breakdown of medium categories in the 1960s. This was an intermediate grounds for experimentation. And Costa reported that this scene was the avant-garde milieu in New York at the time. In an article published in the Argentine literary journal, Sur, he's about this, and I'll return to that. By January of 1969, Costa was already organizing together with Hannah Wiener and the poet art critic John Perrault a show poetry event at the Americas Society, or then the Center for Inter-American Relations, where Costa actually had a job working as a literary program advisor. So the three of them, Costa, Wiener, and Perrault, had asked 18 artists to design outfits. And then Costa, Wiener, and Perrault wrote mock commercial texts about each design, which they read aloud into a tape recording, and that recording was played when the models walked the outfits down the runway. So Alexander Albero has explained that translation across multiple codes was their primary intent here. The codes being fashion and fashion advertising language, but also poetry, art, and media coverage more broadly. By imitating a fashion show or writing in the style of 60s advertising and setting various lateral translations in motion, you're revealing forms as secondary semiological systems, or what Roland Barthes termed myth, and denaturalizing them as modes of signification. And another work by Costa from this time brings such textual analysis to bear on subjectivity or self-representation. Costa had been meeting every week and talking with Wiener and Perrault, but also a loose group of friends, including those you see here, Vito Acconci, Scott Burton, and the poets Anne Waldman and Bernadette Mayer. In May of '69, this group presented a program of 5 nights of poetry events called Theater Works at Hunter College. And Costa's piece, 6 Absences, consists of one of the other members of the troupe, a different person each night, coming on stage and reading aloud from a set of note cards that narrated Costa's bio or CV. And And this is an excerpt from Patrick Greeny's book of Costa's writings that shows all the cards text here. So the text was written in the first person. So a patent disjuncture would arise when Vito Acconci or Hannah Wiener would step on stage and read the text in their own voice. So my name is Eduardo Costa. I was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, etc. And the out of jointness between the words spoken and the perceived appearance, gender, accent of the speaker would have pointed up distinctions between Costa and the other members of this troupe. Costa was the only non-native English speaker and the only member who's not American. And the geopolitical significance of an American representing or speaking for an Argentine at this time must have also been palpable, as the US's interventionist policies in Latin America, as well as American imperialism in the context of the Vietnam War, was at the front of people's minds. One could say Costa was inverting that hemispheric relation of dominance here to refer to a strategy that runs through foundational literatures on Latin American conceptualism. But Costa tests not polarized intention, but rather a transversal one in this work. In authorizing Vito, Scott, Bernadette, John, Anne, and Hannah to identify themselves publicly as Eduardo Costa, he was acknowledging that his and their thinking had so melded together that he was they and they were he. So Six Absences is a Derridian play on difference, suggesting that ourselves are constituted in language or systems of representation, and like the linguistic sign, are never wholly self-present, but rather reliant on different relations for their meaning. But Costa uses this as a means of articulating a collective subjectivity, one found among friends. And we might think here of Stuart Hall's theorizing of cultural identity and diasporic experience. Proposition identity be thought of as a quote production, which is never complete, always in process, and always constituted within, not outside representation. And the exhibition, This Must Be the Place, also raises the way in which these artists' relocation to New York spurred self-recognition as Latin American, but also that there are reasons for wanting to claim an internationalism for artists coming from outside the capitalist core to New York. And I think Costa's work reflects this alternation, or this piece reflects that kind of alternation between the two. So he's stating his background as Argentinian while also speaking to the commonalities that he's crafting among friends and interlocutors outside of a Latin American diaspora. And in Costa's letter to New York, in the Argentine literary journal Sur, that he publishes, he writes it in the late 68, published in early 69. He explains that due to the frequency of poetry events in the city, people would try out a piece one night and then read it or try it again slightly later, the next or a few nights later, and keep working on it as they went from event to event, so that artists were developing their work in a very public manner. And this meant that the city became a kind of open air sort of collective studio, or he calls it a laboratory, in which he writes, quote, behind the scenes, backstage work and rehearsals have practically been done away with. This observation of there being no backstage, I think, kind of correlates to the idea of a decentered subjectivity that's demonstrated in Six Absences. Costa also in this article singles out Hannah Wiener as, quote, a woman who must be considered if we are to understand New York. So taking him at his word, I'll discuss her solo works here just for a moment. Costa describes in his article a live demonstration of Hannah Wiener's code poems that were done in Central Park as part of this series of poetry events in September of 68. So this is a quote from his article. This is the program from those Central Park poetry events. So you see that her code signals opened the first day of the event. So Costa writes, quote, Hannah Wiener had a Navy signal specialist spell out poems made of brief phrases using his flags. Ovates would turn these poems into English as of course the audience had not understood the poems initially. The contrast between the brief English versions and the long, colorful versions made of signal flags codes was remarkable. The reading, quote unquote, ended with the launching of several flares used to transmit calls for help or to indicate one's whereabouts on the high seas. The flares burnt up above the spectators' heads. So Wiener had been composing these code poems by using 19th century Navy and Coast Guard signal books, like this one I've excerpted here, that outlined systems of flag signals and semaphore that could transmit messages visually across long distances and without the need for sound. The books give certain combinations of these signals that denote certain phrases that might be frequently needed between two seafaring vessels. So it sort of streamlines communication in this way. And the poems that Hannah made by appropriating these phrases, like what you see here, from the code books are often funny as they play up the sort of canned or awkward nature of interpersonal communication. But also she reflects on the contradictions of this being a military Navy technology, as many of our communications technologies were. And she also wrote about her interest in a more efficient and universalist means of transmitting messages without recourse to dialect or the written word. So her use of code speaks to a kind of televisual imaginary and countercultural optimism in this era about the connective and universalist promises of globalization, though we know that this instead has taken the form of the free movement of capital and not that of people or labor. So the poetry events were involved in this project, probing the incursion of information technologies and code systems into the realm of writing, I think, and the printed word, as well as social relations. And Catherine's work on how happenings in this period by Marta Minuhin and Leah Lublin and others served as a means of analyzing sociability. This provides a kind of parallel to what I'm talking about here. So to conclude, and returning to Costa's Names of Friends with Wiener's code poems in mind, we can see it as also documenting a visual means of communication for those who can read lips. And like the flares sent up in Wiener's reading that indicate, to quote Costa, one's whereabouts on the high seas. In this film, we could say Costa gives us his coordinates. If we know his names of friends, we can locate him within work, and perhaps as art historians, place his work within a certain context and thereby assign it meaning. But he plays with the legibility of this as well, only mouthing the words or leaving it silent. So like in Six Absences, he questions the sufficiency of a CV or short bio as a means of representing someone in their work, while suggesting that it was the dialogues and interpersonal connections that were the heart of his art making at this moment in New York. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I hope that my network remains good here. So I first want to thank the organizers, and especially, of course, Jaime, whose wonderful exhibition is clearly opening up new avenues of research. And I just want to mention, it's been great to see some emerging scholars at this conference. I feel like our field is in good hands, and I'm also really grateful to organizations like ISLAA for supporting such scholars, particularly at a time like right now. In Latin America, an art does not exist, but its impetus exists in line with its revolutionary situation. So begins Video in Latin America, a talk Jorge Glurberg delivered on January 23rd, 1974 at the Museum of Modern Art's Open Circuits, an international conference on the future of television. Featuring some 40 artists, critics, curators, and theorists of video art, as well as screenings of work, Open circuits drew audiences in the hundreds and remains an important, if somewhat forgotten, moment in early video, archived in the 1977 volume, The New Television, a public-private art edited by Douglas Davis and Alison Simmons. Even though he was the conference's lone representative for Latin America, Glurberg does not identify a single video artist in his essay. Neither does he break down the medium as a feedback system, as might befit a proponent, as I'll discuss in a moment, of systems art. Instead, he lingers, somewhat cryptically, on the idea of revolutionary art as an unfulfilled ambition in Latin America, for which the video alternative, as he puts it, and I think this might be a direct translation from Spanish for alternative video, but I like the conjunction there, and how the video alternative might serve as, quote, a launching pad for a new aesthetic. Glurberg's intervention in New York in this moment must be examined in light of the concurrent foray of his Centro de Arte y Comunicación, or CAIC, into video. At play are two distinct sets of interests, those of a contemporary art institution jockeying for international visibility, and those of transnational artists based in cities like New York, who utilized CAIC as but one node in an array of alternative circuits of production and distribution. As CEO of the lighting company Modulor and director of the Buenos Aires-based CAIC, Glurberg substantially invested his own resources in the promotion of Latin American and specifically Argentinian experimental art. The Centro de Estudios de Arte y Comunicación, as it was originally called, began as the Instituto Cuarto di Tela, the country's key contemporary art institution for much of the 60s, was in decline. Although he would later deny it, Glurberg's institution was modeled on the Di Tella in many respects. CAIC exhibitions were also supplemented by lectures and publications on semiotic, psychoanalytic, and cybernetic theory. Its futuristic, partly subterranean space reinforced the sense that CAIC was actively embracing the newest practices and technologies and promoting local artists alongside their Latin American and international counterparts. Adapting critic Jack Burnham's terminology, Glurberg dubbed the center's early 70s conceptualism Arte de Sistemas, and organized 13 Argentinian artists, including himself, as its widely exhibited practitioners, further promoting its activities to institutions and archives around the world via hundreds of leaflets. And for more on the institution's complex interplay between local and international, I'd refer you to Maria Jose Herrera and Mariana Marchesi's important show at Fundación Oste, as well as a wonderful recent article by Catherine Spencer, who was in this conference in Art Margins. Grupo de los 13 member Luis Benedit was one of the most successful, showing at Venice Biennale, MoMA, and elsewhere in the early 1970s with a series of artificially maintained biological systems. Glurberg, who claimed to have purchased a Portapak in New York as early as 1969, took an interest in video well before open circuits. According to CAIC leaflets, a video titled Homo Sapiens was shown at the first Arte de Sistemas exhibition in 1971, which would make it the first video work in Argentina. Constructing a precise history of such projects is complicated, however, because we are often obliged to take the institution's promotional materials at their word. For example, a group called Ediciones del Tercer Mundo, featuring Glurberg himself, was credited for several videos in this period, including some shown at open circuits. It specialized in documentation of CAIC's exhibitions and artist interviews. Among others of their titles, however, I've seen the conversation between Benedit and Glurberg represented here, and it's definitely a film. Benjamin Murphy has demonstrated that CAIC frequently videoizes other media, as he puts it, such as film stills and photographs, by placing them in TV-like frames on the leaflets. Ediciones del Tercer Mundo's signature image, for example, seen below, is not a video or even a film still, but a press photograph of the Peronist crowds at Ezeiza Airport on the day of the infamous 1973 massacre. The center's approach to video was thus aspirational, sometimes exaggerating the numbers of videos that had been produced and mixing and matching with films. A similarly fluid approach to these media marked CAIC's Festival para Formatos No Comerciales in November 1973, which featured sections for experimental film, documentary, and video art. In the latter section, Homo sapiens was apparently screened alongside videos produced in the United States by Jaime Davidovich, Juan Downey, and others. Davidovich's contribution, listed as Camino, was probably Road in 1972, produced using video editing equipment on off hours at the Cleveland Clinic. Katarzyna Sitlak reports that this same lineup was later screened by Glurberg in international art institutions. And so this would suggest that he had a set of tapes that he took with him as he traveled and was able to screen them at multiple institutions, including MoMA during the Open Circuits conference. Although sadly, neither the program nor the book lists the videos or artists screened. Between 1974 and 1978, CAIC staged 10 so-called open encounters on video held in various international settings. Ultimately, almost all the key figures in Latin American video art would show work in these events. Open Circuits, Art at the Beginning of the Electronic Age, as it was originally titled, was first proposed as an exhibition in 1971 by artist Douglas Davis, television producer Fred Barzik, and SUNY Buffalo media professor Gerald O'Grady. Comfortable viewing areas were proposed to transform MoMA's exhibition galleries for video, with the ambitious content of the show spanning the history of broadcast television in addition to examples of video art. The museum turned the project down, reconceiving it as a 3-day conference split into 3 major categories: structures, aesthetics, and politics and philosophy, that's one category, of television, which were roughly preserved in the book. Reviewing the new television for Leonardo in 1978, Ray E. Knight observed that, quote, "a sense of participation is experienced when reading the book, a feeling that one is witnessing the book in its making, similar to the manner in which TV presents events in progress outside one's home." This is certainly echoed in the book's dynamic graphic design, which alternates between polished typesets and what look like the original presentations with handwritten revisions. If the latter revive the immediacy of dialogues from 3 years prior, other contributions, such as Alan Capro's Old Wine, New Bottle, are reprinted from other publications, with some post-dating the conference. The new television is perpetually reflecting on itself as a document of the first decade of video. Predictably, there's a vast diversity of opinion on the future of television and artists' ability to intervene in it with video tools. Namjoon Paik, who previewed parts of his major work, Global Groove, at Open Circuits, provides a microhistory of his own experiments with television. Others are less exuberant. Art forum critic Robert Pincus Witten likens Open Circuits to the derivative exhibition American Abstract Artists in 1936, suggesting that the Armory show for video, film, and performance was in fact 9 Evenings, Experiments in Art and Technology of 1966. It's instructive to trace the play between theoretical and geographical reflections within the book and their implications for how the contributors are grouped together. At Open Circuits, Glurberg was on another panel called Video and the Museum on January 25th, but in the book, he appears only in the international setting. The group features at least one curious selection: the Swiss art historian René Berger, tasked with reporting on video in both Africa and Asia. Those of us familiar with the global panel have seen such sorts of designations. On the other hand, the artist Shigeko Kubota gave the presentation Women's Video in the US and Japan alongside Glurberg on the 23rd. She ended up in the book under the aesthetics of television with other US and West European figures. Detailing many examples from the New York context the artist had lived in since the 60s as Japanese artists, her essay strikes an explicitly feminist tone. As she writes, video is vengeance and victory of vagina. Willem Flusser, too, a media theorist and resident of Brazil for 30 years, who personally knew many of the artists who would take up video there, appears in the philosophical final section, musing that television is, quote, an improved window, a medium for understanding the world and dialoguing with others, with no mention of geography. The head of CAIC, a cosmopolitan center of conceptualism and critical theory, was in this context treated as a regional expert, anticipating the identity niches that were soon to come for video grants and festival categories, based in the lead up to the 1980 census on the categories Hispanic and Latino. January 1974 was, as I've suggested above, a transitional moment just prior to the open encounters, which may account for Glurberg's lack of specific references to artists and artworks at open circuits. But this still leaves the question of why he omitted so many past examples of television-based art in Argentina, which he surely knew about as an art critic in Buenos Aires in the 1960s. This would include Marta Minujín, who staged a happening on television, used closed-circuit surveillance in La Menasunda in 1965, and produced media content shown on televisions to participants in Simultaneidad, Circuito, and other projects in the later 60s. Roberto Jacobi, who proposed and realized various media works featuring closed-circuit television and other transmission devices. David Lamelas, of the iconoclastic Situación de Tiempo, and Grupo Frontera, who in 1970 brought their closed-circuit television experiments, first undertaken in Buenos Aires, to MoMA's own information exhibition, among many other examples. Glurberg's omissions in this setting consolidated CAIC's monopoly on new technologies, expanded practices, and most importantly, knowledge in the hegemon of one of the world's centers of contemporary art production. But what was Glurberg trying to say in video art and in Latin America? As noted above, the essay is preoccupied with the idea that Latin American art, more generally, has not yet reached a revolutionary stage, in a paraphrase of Marxist dialectics. We might start with the names Glurberg does mention: Brazilian filmmaker Glauber Rocha, Cuban director Julio Garcia Espinosa, and recently deposed Chilean president Salvador Allende. Rocha's 1969 film, Antonio das Mortes, is included with two Colombian conceptual artists and what else but the Grupo de los Trece as examples of, quote, didactic work required to make the language of these artists accessible to the people. Glurberg then quotes Espinosa's manifesto Por un cine imperfecto, which advocates for a Latin American cinema that radically differs from that of Hollywood and commercial film and justifies such filmmakers' lack of experience. Quote, we have had 12 years of cinematographic practice, and we have dedicated very little time to reflection about this practice. We don't have the guilt of someone who has justified their ineptitudes at our expense. In Cuban revolutionary cinema, Glurberg locates a uniquely Latin American approach, liberated both artistically from Hollywood's neocolonialism and politically. Then there's the mention of Allende, whose 1971 speech is quoted reminding, quote, students, intellectuals, workers, that before being a good revolutionary, one should be a good student, a good intellectual, a good worker, end quote. The previous October, CAIC staged an homage exhibition following Augusto Pinochet's takeover of Chile, which led to Allende's death and the detention and torture of thousands of suspected subversives in Santiago's National Stadium. The CIA orchestrated coup occurred 2 months into Juan Downey's, Video Transaméricas, 1973 to 1976, a pioneering experiment in Latin American video that attempted to interconnect different sites the artist visited on a series of travels around the hemisphere, ultimately resulting in longer sojourns with the indigenous Yanomami villagers in Brazil. And Catherine's wonderful talk yesterday, I think, really did a lot to elucidate Downey's approach and this deep integration of cybernetics into his video practice. We might thus see January 1974 as an inflection point at which Glurberg was still characterizing video art in terms of third cinema's valorization of distinctly third world revolutionary art. What Video Transaméricas, like Minujin's media works of the 60s, like Coming Videos by Davidovich, Regina Vater, Evin Vélez, and many others, was television in its transnational expansiveness as a mediator of border crossing and intercultural relations, however hierarchical or even violent, as well as a means to critique such inequities between nations at the dawn of the neoliberal era. Thank you.
Okay, 1 second. I'm just setting up the PowerPoint. Okay, so the research I'm going to present today on the Chilean filmmaker Jaime Barrios is part of my current book project, Foreign Elements, which is on Latin American diasporic filmmakers working from metropolitan centers in the United States starting in the 1960s. Filmmakers who somehow fell out of the Latin American film canon. I published a version of what I'm going to present today on Barrios in article form last year with the journal Discourse, and I'm currently adapting that research into a chapter form for the book. So please feel free to bring in your thoughts. It's a work in progress. I'd also like to mention a dossier on Barrios' figure edited by Julio Ramos with the Chilean film journal La Fuga a couple years back that I also participated in. There are several articles and interviews there if you're interested in exploring his figure further, in particular in relation to experimentation, but also related to Barrios' later militant work. I'd also like to mention that Jaime, Sophia, and I have organized a screening here at the American Society on May 10th with some of the young filmmakers that Jaime Barrios worked with in the 1960s in his community media work. So please stop by. So just a bit of background. Barrios moved from Santiago, Chile to New York City in 1963 to attend the School of Visual Arts. He lived in New York until his death in 1989 at the age of 43. Barrios' experimental work, largely associated with the underground scene, includes Homage to Nicanor Parra, and this is not a demonstration among other works. The Homage film was notorious in Chile because Parra is featured smoking a joint on camera, a scene which has been beautifully analyzed by Julio Ramos. I'd like to begin, though, with a provocation surrounding genre and mode, dating from 1967 from the foreword to Sheldon Renan's classic book-length study of American underground film. A brief aside, with the term undergrounds, I'm referencing the underground film movement, which in many ways coalesced around Jonas Mekas' figure and which had its heyday during the late 1950s and early 1960s, primarily in the New York counterculture. Its most famous practitioners include Kenneth Anger, Jack Smith, Andy Warhol, and it had significant connections with beat literature, pop art, and performance. So now returning to the Renan foreword, which was written by Willard Van Dyke, who, if you know anything about his figure, he's highly associated with the American social documentary movement. At least at first glance, he's an unlikely choice. Van Dyke was then director of the Department of Film at the Museum of Modern Arts and had championed both Barrios' experimental work and his community media activism. In his foreword, Van Dyke emphasizes less the time-worn divide between realism and the underground film tradition or other avant-garde genres, which he does, of course, address. Then upon these modes shared concerns surrounding the problems of form. Both begin and end with the dream he wrote. If you think they represent reality, that is your interpretation. In the spirit of key recent studies that reconsider the cross lineages of experimentation, this paper argues that documentary, underground film, itself a genre of risky definition, and the various collective practices tethered to community media, often associated with realist modes, need not be partitioned in discrete and exclusionary fields. This generic fluidity is especially true within the context of the porous boundaries between aesthetics and politics, between the beautiful and the useful, which are permanently challenged and blurred by Latin American practitioners. Key critics who have developed this critically include Andrea Junta, Jesse Lerner and Luciano Piazza, Mariano Mesmin, Julio Ramos, among others. This paper thus proposes to find the points of contact, the overlaps, and the bleeding through between these modes and genres in New York in the 1960s and early 1970s, a place and a period in which, in the words of Jaime Barrios, a formulation of this exhibit, a migrant Latin American artist, and here I'm quoting Jaime, formed a unique political subjectivity as they made work in the interstices of traditional cultural categories. Jaime Barrios' documentary film club, included in relation to the Young Filmmakers Foundation in part one of This Must Be the Place, alongside other collective work which featured political and cultural activism as their common denominator, is a privileged case study of this interstitial work referenced by Iglesias Luquin. Using Film Club as a case study, I will demonstrate that instead of the singular awakening perception so often imputed to the New York underground scene, that is the personal statement of an individual artist, Film Club is, on the contrary, most potent as a cinematic work in its activation and engagement with the collective and communal sense of self. I will also argue that the film is a hybrid creation, which crosses the idea of utility and aesthetic pleasure. I also want to call attention briefly to this image from Roger Larson, which is, it features Barrios on the right and one of his students on the left. And it's a photograph taken by Helle Hammett, who was a life photographer for many years, but who also collaborated with Maya Deren in her early experimental work. Let's build some context for the film before continuing. Film Club was a 23-minute documentary film by Barrios, principally in the Lower East Side in 1967. The documentary is institutionally centered on the work of the Young Filmmakers Foundation, an organization founded by community media innovators Roger Larson, Lynn Hoffer, and Barrios himself. The organization taught 16mm film production to inner city teenagers from the neighboring Puerto Rican community. Following Didi Halleck, I understand community media to be mediated communication through practical exercises that generate a sense of both individual and non-hierarchical group power over the various apparatus of media and electronic technology. Also, just so you know, Barrios's work is currently housed at the Filmmakers Co-op and at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. And the archival relations here also are significant unto themselves in connection to the film's hybrid genre categorization, both in terms of the co-op's inextricable affiliation with the underground scene in New York, but also because New York Public, in addition to Barrios' students' films, has elements from Barrios' own experimental work, already placing in tension the dichotomy between the utilitarian associations with the Young Filmmakers Foundation, in effect Barrios' day job, versus the labor of Barrios' experimental work, usually presumed to be, by contrast, self-expressive. I'd argue that the archive unto itself becomes an institutional interstitial space as well, in which those binaries and boundaries are broken down as they are done in other ways in relation to Barrios' work. So I'm going to show a brief clip.
Let me make it clear to your listeners that when we say they make these films, that means that they script them, they photograph, direct, act, edit, and do the soundtrack quite by themselves.
In addition to serving as an internal recruitment film, the Film Club screened in the 1960s at both the Robert Flaherty Film Seminar and the newly inaugurated New York Film Festival, yet glaringly sidesteps the NYFF's investment in altruism or clear-cut experimentalism, as well as the Flaherty's well-known fascination with explicitly announced documentary reflexivity. It is influenced in its emphasis on process both by Chilean documentary in the 1960s or the dominant developmentalist aesthetics common to much post-war Puerto Rican audiovisual production and visual production more broadly. Yet as much as it partakes of these principles, Barrios' documentary lacks a programmatic investment in didacticism or in national processes of collective subject formation that critics have largely associated with the latter traditions. Thus, even as Film Club engages a hybrid documentary lineage, it forges its own relationships with authorship, filmic narrative, and the self-determination of representation. Film Club is structured by a series of behind the scenes of student productions, most set to music, interviews of administrative figures, including Larson and Hoffer, and 3 student interviews. Despite being called a film teacher's diary in the 1971 YFF catalog, pointing towards the personal first-person singular connotations of the diaristic genre, Film Club's montage texture and camera perspectives generate the sensation of a collective composite vision oscillating between Barrios and the student filmmakers, only emphasized by Barrios' frequent cameos. The man in the cape, by the way, in the clip is Barrios. As the documentary weaves through a labyrinth of symbolic investments and variables, ranging from funding organisms, community uplift, and the values of the Lyndon Johnson era war and poverty, the student filmmakers portrayed in Film Club reinscribe their own vision of the self through a complex matrix of visual, performative, and rhetorical relations. The subjectivization produced in this operation frustrates any straightforward, liberatory, identitary narrative. At the same time, the uncertain nature of the film's authorship declared proposals complicate its place in established canonical domains. Ultimately, this opens up the possibility of a new critical and spectatorial horizon of expectation for the documentary, in which visual and moral relations and exigencies are configured, reordered, or even refused. Herein, I see the restrictive expectations of diasporic canons and deployments of the self being reconsidered and decentered through the strategic maneuvering of genre, and through work that, alongside other works of the period, embraces a collective vision of the self. The uncertain nature of Film Club's moral purpose gives it a particular flexibility in its horizon of expectation. The documentary's manifest intention is to extol the virtues of student filmmaking and free expression, to construct film as a cathartic escape valve, a balm to the wounds of the inner city, and a transformative artistic practice. Yet it also configures a conflicting dialogue between the aesthetic and moral dimensions of the documentary and its surrounding workshops. There's a clear porosity between utility, realism, and excess. We see what Juan Suarez has described as the underground's abandonment of the modernist preoccupation with personal authenticity. Suarez instead detects a decentered subjectivity which multiplies potential subjects, thus denying the existence of a stable self. In a sense inspired by drug-induced and erotic fantasies, which were frequently elaborately costumed, the student films of the young filmmakers themselves many times propose their own film creation, but consciously and unconsciously, as what Susan Sontag called in the context of the underground, a solvent of morality and aesthetic space to neutralize moral indignation. The student films, even if they stop short of the exuberant and transgressive erotics of the film addressed by Sontag, which was Flaming Creatures, just barely at times, they still implicitly propose a suspension of approval or disapproval of the aesthetic object and the liberation of the aesthetic object from the imperative of moral position. The young filmmakers ran against the moralism of their audience and arguably even against the moralism of the bureaucratic apparatus, patronage, the institutions surrounding them, including in their own moment of production. As Michael Prey has argued, unlike the avant-garde, the metaphorics of the underground do not suggest attack, but evasion. So in another way, the underground and Film Club's intervention pivots not on false identifications, rather upon disidentifications. In a sense, the force and potential of Film Club as a work of art, in my view, resides in the manner in which it plays its role ambivalently in a stuttering yet joyful fashion, a strategy which joins the aesthetic project of Barrios and that of his students, tying the underground and experimental aesthetics with the untutored vision and spontaneity of youth in a continuous feedback loop, alongside other impure influences and contaminations. As Andreas Huysen has written his classic argument surrounding modernism, which I think places film clubs in pure nature within a broader tradition of endemic contamination. So to start heading toward my conclusion in the interest of time, film club has arguably been excluded from a critical field of vision by its difficult assimilation in any single canonical or critical formation, ranging from Puerto Rican and Chilean diaspora and exile studies to the divisions between experimentalism and documentary realism. It also lacks the didacticism of much of community media or even Barrios's later militant work, leaving it in a no man's land. As such, finding itself in a movable site yet to be fixed, Film Club, like much useful cinema, following Charles Auckland and Heidi Wasson's formulation of the paradigm, is still waiting to find its critical location. Its horizon of expectation takes on new historical exigencies, collective and identitary desires, projections, or representations. We see this enacted even in its inclusion, and this must be the place, alongside explicitly experimental audiovisual works, such as that of Leandro Katz's beautiful structural film, Paris Has Changed a Lot, which opened part one, Jose Rodriguez Soltero's underground masterpiece, Lupe from 1966, or Rafael Montañez Ortiz's Golf from 1957, which explicitly interrogates and destroys its unmaterial form with punch holes, albeit a golf instructional video, interestingly enough in the context of this presentation. However, less than a missing link, I'm far from suggesting that, in fact, perhaps the abiding power of Film Club resides in its refusal and doubling of any gaze fixed upon it as a work or as a system of canonical relations. Recalling the words of Willard Van Dyke with whom we began, generic boundaries as any straightforward conceptual operation here prove elusive and tense. So that's it for me for the moment. Thank you.
Hello. I would first like to thank the organizers, America Society and ISLAA, Aimee, Chie, Blanca, and Sophia for inviting me to participate in this exciting and engaging conference. And I also thank the panelists for these compelling papers. I will begin by synthesizing these papers' salient points and arguments, and then I will turn to what I see as some of the parallels between them and the relationships to the panel's broader themes. I will then end with some specific questions for each panelist before opening up the Q&A to the audience. I will start with Annie Ochmanik's paper on Argentine artist Eduardo Costa's involvement in the late 1960s New York conceptual art and poetry scene, and specifically on his friendship and artistic exchange with New York poet Hannah Weiner. Ochmanik argues that in their involvement in the collaborative poetry events of the period, and specifically in Costa's delegated performance, Six Absences, and his film, Names of Friends, and in Weiner's Code Poems and Signal Flag Poems, the two artists both reimagined the connective powers of mediated modes of communication by transmitting messages across linguistic and geographic distances, and by locating themselves within their artistic social networks. As gestures undertaken in the late 1960s, at the dawn of neoliberalism's consolidation in both the US and Latin America, Ochmanik suggests that Costa and Weiner anticipated our current, quote, networked era of global capitalism, which thus demands a reevaluation of the legacies of conceptual art to encompass a critique of how its strategies have become instrumentalized for profit. Our second speaker, Daniel Quiles, interrogates an essay on Latin American video art, originally delivered at MoMA in 1974 and later published in 1977, written by the Argentine conceptual and new media art impresario, Jorge Glurberg. As the director of CAIC, the Buenos Aires Center for New Media and Systems Art in Latin America, Quiles suggests that Glurberg's paper strategically omitted specific references to then current video practice in Latin America, while instead invoking Latin American third cinema's rhetoric of revolutionary nationalism as a smokescreen to both position himself in the global north as a regional expert on Latin American video art and to amplify CAIC's international prestige on the global stage as the incubator of new technologies in Latin American art. In his essay, Glurberg could not identify specific works of Latin American video art, Quiles argues, because it was a field dominated by Latin American artists living abroad and in exile, a condition of production and circulation that defied the revolutionary nationalism Glurberg wished to promote. Lastly, Jessica Gordon-Burroughs examines Film Club, a hybrid format documentary film by the New York-based Chilean filmmaker Jaime Barrios about the student film productions of Puerto Rican youth involved in the Lower East Side's Young Filmmakers Foundation. Gordon-Burroughs argues that Barrios's film exemplifies Jaime Iglesias Luquen's assertion that migrant Latin American art of the period explored the, quote, interstices of traditional cultural categories. Gordon-Burroughs contends that because of this, Film Club decenters the expectations of diaspora canons, such as so-called Latino film, and that unlike traditional documentary or educational films, it avoids moral didacticism in favor of ambiguity, ambivalence, and multivalence, which she argues as its strength. Something that those of us who work on video and film attend to carefully is the specificity of these two distinct media and their differential ontologies and materialities, despite the fact that they both involve the moving image. So I want to emphasize the importance of not conflating film projects such as Costa's Names of Friends and Barrios's Film Clubs with video, as the title of this panel, Networks and Communities Around Video and Television, might compel us to do. Interestingly, as Daniel Quiles points out, this tendency to discuss film as video was also a tactic that Glurberg employed strategically in the promotional leaflets about Caic's exhibitions that he sent to hundreds of international arts institutions, ostensibly to position Caic as a hub of Latin American video production, even when there was little there. But if we think beyond the video film binary, perhaps it is the last term in this panel's title, television, that could serve as a leitmotif for comparative analysis between these papers. Though not specifically addressed in all three papers, we sense the specter of television in Achmanic's discussion of Costa's and Wiener's exploration of mediated transmission and communication strategies, and of course in Costa's previous interest in artistic interventions in the mass media that he had undertaken in Argentina. Similarly, though Gordon-Burroughs does not address Barrios's later documentary films, they were shown on US public television in the 1970s, raising questions around visibility and circulation of experimental film that does not fit neatly into any one category. Quiles directly addresses the relationship of video art to television, making the convincing argument that what much Latin American video art production in the mid-1970s actually did accomplish, and perhaps why Glurberg was hesitant to identify specific works of Latin American video art in his MoMA paper, was that it invoked the transnational specificity of television as a mediator across borders and as a mode of critiquing national hierarchies during the rise of the neoliberal era. This observation aligns Quiles' paper with Achmanic's in their consideration of various art practices as mediated modes of transmission created against the backdrop of neoliberalism's consolidation and culmination in the United States and Latin America at the time. Ultimately, this panel urges us to contemplate the roles and circuits of networks and communities as related to the moving image. And on this point, I want to home in on Iglesias Luquen's comment that migrant Latin American art practices operated within the interstices of cultural categories, which Gordon-Burroughs rightly references in exploring the genre-bending experimentalism of Barrios's Film Club. This concept could also be applied to the not quite categorizable intermedial and collaborative poetry events and public interventions Costa and Wiener were involved in at the same time. And by contrast, though, Glurberg seems to have sought to capitalize on these kinds of interstitial practices and hybrid approaches for different ends by labeling them, coining the term arte de sistemas, for instance, and promoting them. He seems to have sought to advance Caic's prestige as an innovation hub for these kinds of practices and a new aesthetic. Now I'd like to wrap up my comments with some questions for each panelist before we turn the Q&A over to the audience. So Annie, my first question is for you. You suggest that Costa and Wiener's projects might provoke a reevaluation of the legacies of conceptual art that turn what you describe as, quote, text, data, and information. This is what Benjamin Buchloh famously described as conceptual art's administrative aesthetic, its reliance on the visual language of institutions and of bureaucracies. So I'm wondering about the relationship of your argument to Buchloh's essay and what he posits as conceptual art's shift from an aesthetic of administration to a critique of institutions, And if your greater dissertation argument, which I understand it to be that experimental art practices of the 1960s were ultimately instrumentalized to profit-driven logics, I'm wondering if that doesn't just recapitulate Buclow's assertion that the aesthetics of administration, quote, mimed the operating logic of late capitalism and its positive instrumentality. Or if not, what is the relationship between your project and Buclow's thinking in that influential essay? For Daniel, I was wondering if you are familiar with another moment at MoMA just 7 years after the Glurberg talk there. That's the 1981 MoMA exhibition curated by US curator Barbara London, titled Video from Latin America, which included 21 works of Latin American video art and which emphasized the tropes of the Latin American artist in exile and Latin American video art as a form of political resistance to repressive regimes back home. I'm wondering how you interpret the relationship between these two moments, which both took place at the same museum, and how this later MoMA exhibition might be seen as an outgrowth from or a repudiation of Glurberg's narrative of Latin American video art as articulated in his 1974 paper. And then lastly, Jessica, I'm thinking about your broader book for which your paper is going to form a part of a chapter, and your consideration of Latin American diasporic filmmakers working in the US during the 1960s onward, who, as you put it, somehow fell out of the Latin American film canon, which I'm assuming might be due to their experimentalism, but perhaps you can expand on why these films that you're looking at fell out of the Latin American film canon. But since in this paper on Barrios, you seem to question the Latin American film canon itself, as well as other distinct canons like documentary and underground filmmaking, to suggest that the strength of Barrios's work is that it was not so easily categorizable, I'm wondering then, why try to recuperate the Latin American film canon or others as categories in your larger book project? So I'll give the speakers a moment to respond, and then I'll shift over to audience questions. We have, it looks like, about 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chilean. Yeah, so I'll just reply to your point. Thank you for bringing up also Buclow's essay, which, yeah, really directs and kind of determines a lot of the discourse on conceptual art from when he writes it, which is 89, publishes it in 90 onward. And yeah, I think in my larger project of kind of reassessing legacies of conceptualism and its global developments, I am hoping to sort of push against the many of the arguments that sort of arose also from Buclow's essay about the kind of failures or shortcomings of conceptual art, and some of the kind of straw men that get positioned for how, you know, conceptual art failed, whether it's in its anti-commodity stance or anti-visual stance. Buclow, but also different participants in conceptual art sort of attest to its failures or its folding into the logics of capital. But I'm actually hoping to argue against that following these figures. And part of that is a kind of realization that history, when conceptual art starts to get historicized, it's like the very end of the Cold War. So I think that there's this kind of end of history logic that maybe clouds some of those arguments about conceptual arts sort of folding into these profit-driven logics after all. Whereas today we can kind of take distance from that. And, you know, for various reasons, I think we see a kind of more, I don't know, longer story today. So I think with what Costa and Wiener are doing, and part of this is bringing in the element of poetry, but also the kind of farcical aspects that approach brings to kind of mining these myths, like with the fashion show poetry event, modes of demystifying or more literary approaches also to text and language and its mediation of social relationships, that I think these open onto different possibilities of what conceptual art was trying to do, but also I think it's important to keep in mind the kind of horizon of possibility that they were working under at the time. I mean, obviously it's this moment of 68, but also I think often of Luis Kamnitzer's writing on Latin American conceptualism, and this would apply to Costa. I think that they had both a literary approach and a Borgesian idea of tautology that differs from Bucklow's kind of Weberian understanding of tautological logic and Kosuth's conceptual art. But also, Kamnitzer points out they had this awareness of the Cuban Revolution as a kind of horizon of possibility, for the possibility was real to kind of change the world or to manage society differently at that time. So I think sorry, I'll stop talking, but to give more credit to what these artists were doing, I think that kind of context is useful to reassert.
Daniel, if you want to address my question, and then actually I'm gonna, because I want to make sure to get to some audience questions, I'm going to shift for a question for Annie from the audience. If you have anything, Daniel, to respond to with my question.
I do. First of all, Annie, I was loving what you were saying. Maybe we can email a little because I have more questions for you, but I really was enjoying that. Jillian, thank you so much. That was super eloquent summary. Jessica, I really enjoyed that as well. So yes, Barbara London was part of Open Circuits. She had just become MoMA's first video curator in 1970, like right as that conference was happening. So, you know, when you talk about this exhibition in 1981, it's, I think in terms of video, those of you who study video, this is not news, but it's just a completely different moment in every respect, because in those intervening years, a remarkable volume of funding becomes available. You have the rise of these media centers all over the US. That's just one example of a nation that's actively supporting the development of video, accessibility of equipment for filming and editing, and so on. It's a wonderful and interesting question. Should we see this 1981 exhibition as something of a repudiation of whatever version of Latin American video is delivered even by the book in 1977? Obviously, one thing we're sort of obliged to point out whenever we talk about CAIC is their troubling relationship to the dictatorship, both in Argentina and in Brazil, which awarded the so-called Grupo de los Trece, although by that time a lot of the original members had gone into exile, but they were still awarded a prize at the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1978. So those kinds of connections were around Glurberg even in the earlier 70s, because he had done some curating for the Sao Paulo Biennial even during boycotts that were going on in New York. You know, so this sense of controversy around him was always there. And then obviously, if you're making a statement by taking video and positing as something as like almost a signature medium of exile, that does shift the focus a bit. But I would also suggest, in a way, the categories that are established where you have this expert on a region who's plunked on a panel, that actually does continue a logic of a geographical way of framing new technologies, which obviously you have to frame them somehow, but I think that actually is more of a point of continuity. However, emerging scholars out there who are doing such wonderful things and have maybe more time than some of us, I just want to point out, look up that 81 exhibition. Some terrific artists there who I think really, really need more attention. Some of them I've been looking at myself. Tony Labat and Edin Vélez, among others, are just, I'm really surprised that there isn't more literature out there about them, and it's a huge list. So, another component of all this, of course, is that this is a standing archive for all of us to get back into. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So we're running short on time. I do want to give Jessica just a quick moment to respond to my provocation, but I do have another question I'd like to ask from the chat. So Jessica, I know I asked like a big question that's hard to unpack quickly, but I don't know if you want to say a few quick words and then I'll get to that question so we can keep on time.
Yeah, so the manuscript is sort of a dual response to both New Latin American cinema, which was very dominant. That's obviously intertwined with Third Cinema, which is also interesting to see the Espinosa text invoked even in video, right? And there you see the dominance as it sort of extends across audiovisual work from Latin America in the period. But then also experimental moving image forms within the United States, which tended to be perhaps universalist in a way that these filmmakers were not. So when you asked whether it was that they were too experimental, many times, in fact, they had some realist modes that were contaminating their work that made them difficult to assimilate within a North American avant-garde moving image scene. So
Okay.
I'll leave it there.
Chia, do we have time for me to address one of the questions from the chat quickly?
Yes.
So Alex Kitnick is addressing Annie. Thinking about your talk and the title in particular, I'm remembering Lytle Shaw's book on Frank O'Hara and the politics of coterie and Reva Wolf's Warhol poetry and gossip book. I guess my question is pretty straightforward. Any thoughts about the connections between poetry and coterie gossip friends? Is poetry more social than art?
Oh, thank you, Alex. Is poetry more social than art? I mean, part of what I think is interesting about kind of bringing poetry into the equation is the different sites of circulation or modes of circulation that it brings. I mean, whether it's a reading or journals. Also, I didn't talk about that, but there's a social element to a lot of these poets were, publishing journals in a way that was really democratic. It was fairly easy to type up and staple and publish and distribute your journals, and that was going on. And I think it's an interesting kind of corollary to how conceptual artists talked about, and the ways that it was newly mobile, and the ways that it also develops networks and mail art. There's a lot of writing about this, of course. So there's questions of how it circulates, it gets away from the kind of gallery or museum exhibition, and questions of institutionalization get kind of broken open. But also I think that, so is poetry more social than art? It kind of, this like adds a different angle to the question of the phenomenological subject that a lot of, I guess, going back to Buchloh, but also Krauss, Foster sort of historicized this shift of the 60s as one towards this direct phenomenological address of the viewer. But I think that there's a kind of mystery there in a way about what the actual effect is on viewers. And Tom Crow writes about this, like that it assumes that the person coming up to a Richard Serra either cares or is educated enough to care that they are being addressed by this phenomenological experience. Whereas poetry, these poetry events, poetry readings, don't really have that relationship to objecthood in this question that kind of around which a lot of the art history of this period circulates. So I do think it has a social relationship to readership and to community that differs from art. I don't know if I could make a blanket statement that it's more social than art. But that's kind of why I like Costa's article so much, is that he attests from the inside of this community that at least, there was an audience that was kind of ready-made. There was this immediate kind of collective reception and production going on that sort of answers the question in a way of like, where is the public being addressed by art at the time?
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you to all the panelists. Unfortunately, there's still lots to think about and talk about, but we are out of time. I want to encourage the audience to please stay for our next panel, Artistic Communities in New York, coming up next. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Gillian, for the thoughtful responses at your panel, and for all the speakers in panel 3 for the wonderful presentations. I am Tia Jojima, Assistant Curator at American Society, a PhD candidate in art history at the Graduate Center CUNY, and one of the organizers of this conference. I am so happy to see this conference come to fruition, after months of preparation. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank people, especially thank Blanca Serrano from ISLAA, who helped me with the selection of papers, and she also helped me putting all the panels together. And then Jaime, Sofia. I would also like to thank the wonderful team at American Society, especially Sofia, Guillermo Zubillaga, and Luisa Leme, who are working really hard to make sure that this event functions smoothly. But I'm here to introduce the speakers and the moderator of our 4th panel, which has been organized around artistic communities in the city. So I'm going to be reading their bios, and then the panel will begin with all 3 presentations, followed by remarks and questions by Josh Franco. And during the presentations, I would like to encourage you to send questions on the Q&A box so that Josh can then read them to the speakers during Q&A. Amalia Cross is our first speaker. She is an art historian, writer, and curator. She has a master's degree in art history and theory from Universidad de Chile and is a PhD candidate in history at Universidad Católica de Santiago. Her research projects and publications focus on Latin American and Chilean art history, with special emphasis on exhibitions, histories, radical museology, uncommon archives, and queer artists. Currently, she's working as an assistant professor at the Art Institute of the Universidad Católica de Valparaíso, teaching creative techniques and theories and methodologies for research in art and visual culture. Our second speaker is Rachel Kaplan, who is assistant curator of Latin American art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Her research focuses on modern Latin American art with additional interests in histories of collecting and display. She curated the exhibition Rufino Tamayo, Innovation and Experimentation for LACMA's Satellite Gallery at Charles White Elementary School. And she also authored the accompanying publication titled Rufino Tamayo, The Essential Figure. She joined LACMA in 2015 as the Wallis Annenberg Curatorial Fellow after receiving her PhD that same year from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU. Our third speaker, Melissa Ramos Borges, is an art historian with a predilection for the revision of the discipline. She obtained her doctorate from the Programa de Estudios Artísticos, Literarios y Culturales with a specialty in art history at the Universidad Autónoma of Madrid, where she presented the first comprehensive study of avant-garde art produced between the 1960s and 80s in Puerto Rico. She's a professor in the art history and theory programs at University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and Rio Pedras campus. In addition, she's an independent researcher and curator who has presented her curatorial work and published articles in international platforms. And finally, our discussant, Josh Franco, is the National Collector of the Archives of American Art. In this role, he works to identify, investigate, and acquire personal papers, institutional records, and other primary sources that tell the stories of American art. In addition to ensuring their preservation at the Smithsonian, Josh Franco advises researchers working in the archives, making them aware of materials relevant to their pursuits. Previously, he served as Latino collection specialist at the Archives of American Art from 2015 to 2017. So let's start with the presentations, and welcome to our Zoom stage, Amalia.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to all that made possible this conference. To start my presentation, I need to turn on the radio.
Radio Nueva York presenta Arte desde Nueva York.
Arte desde Nueva York was a radio program hosted by the Chilean artist Nemesio Antúnez that aired on Radio New York worldwide in the United States and several Latin American countries. These audio recordings correspond to 53 chapters that aired between February 1967 and June 1968, and are conserved as an exceptional set of audio files in the archive of the Nemesio Antúnez Foundation in Santiago de Chile. The Sunday program was broadcast weekly, and in 30 minutes, Antúnez reported on cultural news about Latin American art in New York, while at the same time talking with a series of key figures in the growing art scene. The purpose of the program was to capture the artistic life of New York on all these expressions. In this sense, radio was the medium to precisely capture, record, broadcast, and reproduce these expressions in an attempt to be, quote, a faithful reflection of all the manifestation of this artistic world that is New York, end of the quote. The radio program was part of the Antúnez work as the cultural attaché from Chile, a diplomatic function that he carried out in New York, not in Washington, D.C., as was officially appropriate to do. From the beginning of 1965 to the end of 1968. In this period that established his friendship and collaboration with other artists, his management capacity in the creation of new projects, and his interest in the dissemination of art through the mass media. Like so many parties, the celebration of his appointment as a cultural attaché was held in his studio on Bank Street in the West Village, and attended by over 150 people, including musicians, galleries, museum and art directors. Also the artists Enrique Castro Cid, Silvia Palacios, Julio Leparc, Alberto Greco, Claudio Badal, Liliana Porter, Luis Kadmitzer, and Fernando Botero, who were his close circle of friends, were there together with an extensive network of people with whom he met daily to discuss, in his words, Latin American artistic activity and how to effectively increase it. A few years later, this conversation also took place on radio show, responding to the need to spread Latin American art, amplify its milestone, commenting on exhibitions, books, and catalogs with art historians such Leopoldo Castedo or Statun Lumis Catlin, and make artists known to millions of Spanish-speaking listeners. As Carla Stelbeck proposed, New York was a place like a magnet that attracted artists from all Latin American countries. A magnetic field where artistic ideas arrive and were transmitted like radio waves to the rest of the world through airspace or by magnetic recording tapes. That magnetic force is what made Rolando Peña, for example, want to unite the dispersed, the union of all the arts and all Latin American artists with the same concern in the Foundation for the Totality, a group where the Colombian poet Manuel Quinto, the Cuban painter Waldo Díaz Balar, and the Chilean artists Juan Downey and Jaime Barrios participated. In an edition of Arte desde Nueva York, the Venezuelan artist Peña gives an account of the origin and development of the totality thing. Peña illustrates this idea, laughing and never losing his good humor, commenting on his works. One of them was a 3-hour happening entitled The Paella Bicycle Totality Crucifixion. The happening took place at a party at Díaz Balar house. The house was literally on fire. It involved a paella, someone coming through a window on a bicycle, broken glasses, and naked people were running around. This work is also part of the 25-hour-long experimental film 4 Star by Andy Warhol. On June 3rd, 1968, Warhol was shot 3 times by Valerie Solanas, a feminist author of the Scam Manifesto. A few days later, Antúnez talked about this and about independent cinema with Jaime Barrios, the Chilean filmmaker and author of Chilenos en Nueva York, Homenaje a Nicanor Parra, and Film Club. The latter, part of the exhibition This Must Be the Place, and very well explained today by Jessica Gordon, is a documentary about the Young Filmmaker Foundation. And the talk with Antúnez is based on this experience of art and social work. Arte desde Nueva York began with opening music, where a masculine voice presenting the program with dramatic sound of violins and drum rolls in the background. And it was hearing this sound that I thought of Marshall McLuhan and his idea of radio as the tribal drum. In his media theory, radio is a hot medium that provokes the opposite of individualism. It can summon collectivity. In this experience, according to McLuhan, quote, the subliminal depth of radio are charged with the resonating echoes of tribal horns and antique drums. And it is the Asian experience of kinship webs of deep tribal involvement survive that makes a tribe. In this case, a large community of Latin Americans, recognizing themselves as such and communicating through sound, music, and voice. I refer to McLuhan not only to talk about the nature and implication of media, but also to echo the great impact that his idea had at that time. According to the Canadian thinker, the network of electrical links operate as an extension of our nervous system, and the radio is a highly sensitive experience of information. This idea resonated in the exploratory work that some artists were doing at the time with media, and that perhaps Marta Minuchin has taken it further. In the show dedicated to Minuchin, the conversation between them is enthusiastic. Minuchin takes the microphone to talk about her recent work. The Minuphone is an alternate phone box inside which the participant can have, in the word of the artist, an immersive experience of information about himself for 3 minutes. In this work, Minuchin uses the telephone to reflect on communication and the media. Antúnez asked her, how you come to think about such a thing? And Minuchin responds.
Me ayudó mucho a comprender todo esto fue Marshall McLuhan,
¿Ah, sí?
que es un escritor que
Claro,
escribe sobre los medios de comunicación.
Mass media, ¿no?
Claro. Y bueno, él y otra gente, yo estaba interesada en mass media, entonces me di cuenta que lo importante era meterse en la comunicación, es decir, yo aprovechando una cosa que él dijo, que Vietnam podría haber sido un país inventado, porque uno lo conoce nada más que a través de los medios, de diarios, revistas y cine. Entonces me di cuenta que en los medios se puede inventar todo. Yo en este momento puedo llegar a decir que estoy creando una estructura electrónica en Central Park, entonces toda Latinoamérica podría creerlo, claro, porque está por radio. Es decir, las cosas quieren peso e importancia porque están en los medios, porque en este momento todos son medios. Entonces yo...
At the end of the program, the artist says that she will really like to have a television program, the Marta Minuchin Show, or failing that, use some other means of communication. 6 years later, in 1974, Minuchin and Downey, along with Leandro Katz, collaborated with Claudio Badal on an evening with Salvador Allende, an act of solidarity with Chile that he organized at the Madison Square Garden. Badal is an artist and a poet who had been at Antúnez naming parties, had been the great love of Alberto Greco, and secretary of Enrique Castro Cid. In his accounts, Castro Cid was a kind of legend of the history of art. Perhaps that is why the Antúnez interview is so valuable, to hear his voice and understand his work. His transit from Chile to New York when he arrived in 1961, and his transitions from painting to robotic art. Regarding the latter, Antúnez asked him, How did you go from this painting that is anatomical, biological, biomorphic, to a technological thing that is radio, the transistors, electronic machines, the computers? Because that is another language, isn't it? But for Castro Cid, there is no separation between mechanics and anatomy, between technology and man. Technology for him is an extension of the human body, just as radio is an extension of the nervous system for McLuhan. A series of mechanisms and connections that enable communication, movement, and life. In this regard, Castro Cid says,
atención. Dije, bueno, al mismo tiempo me acuerdo que yo me empezaba a interesar mucho por los trabajos de Norbert Wiener sobre cibernética, ¿no? Y sobre esto que él llamó también en el primer libro de cibernética en el año 50 creo que se publicó, llamó el simulacro de vida. Entonces, bueno, estos dos elementos para mí, si al principio no tenían ninguna relación muy ajustada, crearon una atmósfera de pensamiento, ¿no? Y de exploración. Y yo hice combinaciones de elementos mecánicos con elementos anatómicos, en cierto modo para mostrar esta no distinción en el fondo, ¿no? Entre lo que era la tecnología o lo mecánico, ¿no? y lo que era del cuerpo, lo que era el hombre como ser muscular o como ser orgánico. Esto se puede referir también al hombre y su environment, al hombre y su medio.
His robots simulate the effect of life because they are, in his word, a simulacrum of sentimental life, a primitive desire to produce life. From this last idea and closing the program, Antúnez talked about his works, especially a robot he saw on a recent visit to Castro Cid studio. The robot in question was activated by means of sound. An applause set his movement in motion, and then Nemesio, amazed, could not stop applauding. I felt a similar desire when faced with Anthropomorphical 1 and 2, the Castro Cid robots, when I went to visit recently the second part of the exhibition, This Must Be the Place. The person who takes care of the works kindly agreed to turn on the robot, and I never thought I could ever be able to see this work live, because they have only been exhibited once in Chile in March 1969 at the La Nueva Beta, La Figura, an exhibition of North American artists that was shown at the National Museum of Fine Art in Santiago. This exhibition coincided with the beginning of the Antúnez new position as director of that museum. At the beginning of that year, Antúnez returned to Chile to be hired by the government of President Frey and then by President Allende to modernize the museum, that is, to transform it into a living, active, and dynamic center as it did not exist until then. Antúnez remodeled the building, created new exhibition spaces, set up the hall of the museum for happening and concerts, invited young artists to exhibit, and thereby revolutionized the idea of art and museum. He used the museum also as a vehicle of experience, and during his years of direction, the museum was no longer an end, that is, where the works end, but a medium through which the first manifestation of a conceptual and experimental art were carried out in Chile during the Unidad Popular. For this, he had the collaboration of the artists he had met in New York. In 1969, he invited Luis Canmitzer and Liliana Porter to make their ambientaciones. In 1971, he received Gordon Mataclar and Jeffrey Louis, who carried out intervention in the museum, as did Cecilia Vicuña, Lea Lublin, among many other artists. Artists like Juan Downey and Francisco Copello never managed to hold their exhibition projects as the coup d'etat prevented them. And the military, among other terrible acts, decided to expropriate and take control of the media in general, and especially the radio stations, with the aim of demobilizing and depoliticizing the tribe. Finally, for me, the simultaneity between the works that Latin American artists were developing in New York and Antúnez radio program are part for the same desire for communication and the construction of collaborative networks as a form of community, where thinking like this electronic sculptor Bagdawni, the use of technology takes place, the transmission of invisible energy and the human voice in a time and space situation for the ears. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the American Society and ISLAA for organizing this wonderful conference. I am delighted to be participating and to be continuing now the conversation about the community in which Antúnez and others participated. He always believed that life was borrowed. It didn't belong to anyone. Transfigurations, shadows that leave. He was always tired, very tired. Now he awoke. He was dreaming that he was tired and that he walked and walked, carrying a mattress on his back, and the street was full of debris, filth, and old things. These lines are from the opening paragraphs of Manhattan Nonstop, a text by the Chilean artist Guillermo Nuñez. The short prose follows its protagonist as he traverses a cold Manhattan by foot, subway, and ferry. The junk he encounters is a common thread throughout this text. Nuñez arrived in New York in October 1964, joining a community of fellow compatriots that included Nemesio Antúnez, Carlos Irrizary, and Iván Vial. He immersed himself in the city, visiting its galleries and museums, absorbing its television and print media, and encountering the detritus of daily life, all of which he described as a new and different landscape, which had immediate and lasting ramifications in his artistic process. Using Nuñez as a through line, this talk will focus on the close cohort of Chilean artists he associated with during his time in New York between 1964 and 1965. Through archival images and documents, as well as works of art, this talk aims to reconstruct the artistic identity and creative community these artists developed in New York and continued upon their consequent returns home to Chile. For Nuñez, Irrizary, Vial, and other Chilean artists arriving in New York in the 1960s, Nemesio Antúnez, whom we just heard about, served as an important mentor and guide. Antúnez had first arrived in Manhattan in 1943, studying architecture at Columbia and printmaking at Stanley William Hayter's Atelier 17. He established an artistic network and took up the city and its inhabitants as a theme, notably working at the Ladies' Home Journal on a 30th floor office in Rockefeller Center, where he was struck by the contrasting scale of skyscrapers with the ant-sized humans below. He captured studies of these juxtapositions and dramatic angles in personal photographs and pictured the city masses in his prints and paintings. In 1964, Antúnez was named Chile's cultural attaché to the United States, accepting the appointment on the condition that he could live in New York, the cultural center where he felt he could best support Chile's creative producers. Back in New York, the city again became a subject of interest as he depicted the daily life of anonymous crowds, with the rigid grids of New York's blocks and buildings ordering his compositions. His archives preserve letters from his 5-year tenure sent by artists, musicians, and writers who sought assistance in finding apartments to rent. As a result, it is perhaps unsurprising that many of the artists ended up living in Lower Manhattan in proximity to one another, facilitating their sense of community. In addition, convenient access to institutions where the artists studied and taught, such as the New School and NYU, as well as Pratt in Brooklyn, should not be overlooked. Antúnez himself, at one point, had space on 10th Street on the corner of Tompkins Square Park. Here, he again recorded his view in reference photographs, which often reappeared in his paintings. The park's boundaries and ball courts structuring faceless masses. Previously, as we heard, he had space on Bank Street, as did Carlos Irrizary and Guillermo Nuñez, whose apartment at 110 Bank Street had roof access and became a gathering spot for the tight-knit group. This is evidenced in a set of photographs taken by Chilean cartoonist and illustrator Fernando Cran, who captured a gathering of artists and their families on Nuñez's rooftop, to celebrate the visit of Roberta Mata to New York. And if you can see my cursor, we see Mata here in the center, surrounded by Eduardo Martinez Bonatti, Nuñez hiding behind him, but also visible up here, Antúnez, Vial, as well as family members. Just as Antúnez's adopted city became one of his subjects, it likewise had a direct impact on the work of his peers. They absorbed their surroundings, and the results infiltrated their canvases. Ivan Vial, who came to New York on a Fulbright in 1965, engaged directly with geometric abstraction, kinetic art, and stretched canvases, and began experimenting with new materials such as aluminum and motors, a clear departure from his informalist paintings of the preceding years. Carlos Irrizary, also in Manhattan on a Fulbright, similarly explored new materials including glass, plastic, metals, and polyester. We see the abstract symbols of this earlier work on the left taking on sci-fi appearances with his inclusion of the new materials, such as mesh wire here, which gives his work this doubling appearance, as well as plastics. He continued to use these materials after his return to Chile, investigating the intersections of art, industry, and technology. For Guillermo Nuñez, encounters with pop art and the city's abundance of mass media would have a profound effect on his artistic practice. Just 2 months before Nuñez arrived in New York, US Congress had signed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon Johnson authorization to use military force in Southeast Asia. The horrific images making their way out of Vietnam through television and print media wove themselves into Nuñez's work as the artist grappled with the war's ongoing death and destruction. Violent abstractions were not new to Nuñez's work. In November 1963, just less than a year before his arrival in Manhattan, he exhibited a group of paintings in Santiago on the theme of America, and especially the pain and violence of conquest. These early paintings introduced the abstract visual languages that Nuñez would continue to develop and show the rootedness of his art in place, in this case, a hemispheric understanding of America. A painting from the series, América Empieza Ahora, in part a response to the events of the Cuban Revolution, garnered the artist a prize from the Compañía de Acero del Pacífico in conjunction with the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo in Santiago, and signaled his increasing recognition before his arrival in New York. Once there, the media portrayal of war helped to further shape Nuñez's concerns. The spikes and thorns of these earlier works gave way to new imagery evoking human bones and teeth. He embraced the structure of the pop comic strip, which appeared in his works in direct quotations as a compositional device. In 1965, filmmaker Maurice Zamar recorded Nuñez in his studio working on this painting, which is now in the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The resulting film, The World of Guillermo Nuñez, encapsulates the cross-section of media, artistic practice, and city life that converged in Nuñez's Bank Street apartment. In this clip, hopefully, we see Nuñez working on the monstrous helicopter at the left of the canvas, directly inspired by the Time magazine that he holds in his hands. Used for support and evacuation, as well as attack, helicopters saw greater use in Vietnam than in previous wars and became a ubiquitous symbol in the media. Reinterpreting the aircraft as part beast and part machine, Nuñez heightened the terror that they caused. A second clip shows the busy street as Nuñez exits from his studio. And a montage of words and images scrolls through. While Nuñez continues his media consumption at a quintessential New York diner. He returns to the studio to contemplate his completed painting. While scholarship and Nuñez's own words, place importance on his time in New York, and particularly on the role of print media in the Vietnam War in shifting his practice, here we have preserved direct evidence of these claims, and again, the final painting. The images that Nuñez studied in magazines and newspapers would soon appear directly in his works. His clippings transferred to canvas via silkscreen as a point of departure for, in his own words, his plastic commentary. In Manhattan Nonstop, Nuñez wrote that, quote, "It seemed New York was full of the things the world threw out. Surely they had been dumped to be taken somewhere else, but we spoiled the plan." In one sense, these clips and magazines are among the waste that Nuñez rescued and repurposed. He and his peers consumed everything that New York had to offer. However, at the same time, their artworks display an ambivalence, an uneasiness toward their new home, from Antúnez's expressions of disconnect or isolation to Nuñez's direct critique of US imperialism and excess in his paintings. Writing in 1966 about differences between art in Chile and the United States, Nuñez makes clear distinction between Chile as part of America in the hemispheric sense and the United States, suggesting a clear divide in the experiences of the US and the rest of the Americas. Published interviews with Antúnez from around the same time use similar language to distinguish North American sensibilities. In New York, these feelings of difference could be countered by the community that the Chilean artists built together. While the artists enjoyed solo exhibitions at a range of New York area galleries, their works were often exhibited together in group shows devoted either to Chilean artists or to Latin American artists more broadly. Here we see group exhibitions from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, as well as the Couturier Gallery, extending New York to its Connecticut suburbs. And the artists also participated in exhibitions uptown and downtown, including at the Zagreb Gallery on East 8th Street, which was founded in 1953 by fellow Chilean Armando Zagreb. These group exhibitions extended the community that the artists created for themselves. After artists returned to Santiago, correspondence shows Antúnez continuing to act on their behalf in New York, organizing exhibitions, but also serving as a liaison and manager on the ground, facilitating sales and depositing funds from galleries. Despite these successes, for the artists under consideration here, their time in New York was brief. The label of being Chileans in New York, however, followed the artists home. In November 1966, the Instituto Chileno Norteamericano de Cultura hosted an exhibition of the recently returned artists Nuñez, Ortúzar, Vial, and Eduardo Martínez Bonatti. Reviewing the exhibition for El Mercurio, critic Antonio Romero noted that, quote, "The work of these artists seems to result from the shock sustained by four sensibilities before an extraordinary metropolis. The artists have received the influences of New York in different ways. Or, to be more precise, they have each reflected what is closest to their own temperaments," end quote. Accordingly, the exhibition brochure offered quotes from each of the participating artists on their relationship to place, and especially New York. Ortúzar jokes about the crimes he has committed in New York's name, Bonatti roots himself in Chile, and Vial alludes to how New York stimulated his artistic investigations. For Nuñez, again, New York emerges as a catalyst. He says, quote, "I don't paint, I'm a machine recording rejected facts, and this is how I show them. I realized in New York that my protest could be more direct if I didn't pass it through any filters of embellishment. A neon sign, a trash can, they're beautiful on their own without needing interpreters. New York showed this to me starkly, and I am on this path." After his return to Santiago, Nuñez also had a solo exhibition of his drawings made abroad. The drawings, a diary of his time in New York, responded to international violence in Vietnam and the Dominican Republic, which Nuñez explicitly stated in the exhibition's brochure seen here. Like in his paintings, drawings from this period borrowed bright colors and comic strip formats from pop art, a resonance that was readily recognized and credited to his New York stay. However, as Nuñez told Antúnez in a missive back to Manhattan, while the exhibition proved to be a critical success, it was an economic failure. In July 1968, Antúnez, visiting Santiago, similarly held an exhibition of his New York works. Whereas Nuñez's return exhibition was a diary of his time spent away, Antúnez's provided a portrait of the city, his compositions accordingly titled after the various Manhattan zip codes seen here. The work certainly left an impression on critics, who commented on their dark, nightmarish qualities. Writing for the newspaper El Mercurio, painter Mario Carreño, while acknowledging the paintings as some of the most important of Antúnez's career, describes the canvases as having, quote, "no dawn," only the dark, deep night of the dehumanized masses. To which Antúnez responded, there is no science fiction in my painting. It is the pure reality that I feel when I live in New York, and I enjoy it. In another interview for the exhibition, he explains that, quote, in New York, I paint a lot. It demands it of me. This sentiment is similarly expressed in letters he received from Nuñez and Ortúzar after their returns to Santiago. They report difficulties readjusting to artistic life in Chile. Ortúzar wrote of the importance for artists to maintain contact with New York and that they should return at least once a year. Following Nuñez's drawing exhibition, Ortúzar reported to Antúnez that Nuñez was so depressed, the only thing he could think about was returning to New York. Ortúzar's regular letters to Antúnez give updates not just on himself, but also Vial, Ortúzar, and Nuñez, again pointing to the persistence of this Manhattan group. For his part, Nuñez wrote to Antúnez, warning him, don't move from New York, don't think about returning. The expressed desires to return to Manhattan on the part of these artists not only affirms the creative impact the city held over their work, but attests to the community that they built and fostered while there. To conclude, I'll return to Nuñez's own words from Manhattan nonstop. Manhattan was black, full of lights and little cars that rushed from one side to the other. Suddenly, it began to sink, slowly, slowly. The island was sinking with the lights on, so that they were still visible underwater, shimmering slightly like Christmas lights. When everything disappeared, it left a black hole and the water warbled. Some boards and newspapers were left marking the spot. For Nuñez and his compatriots, returned from their New York sojourns, Manhattan continued to be a lasting, lingering memory, their own artworks left to mark the spot. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, ISLAA and the America Society for the opportunity to share my research in this conference. In today's talk, I will try to contextualize Puerto Rican artist Carlos Irizarry's two artistic political actions in the 1970s, which referenced radical acts led by anti-colonial ideals and the struggle for independence of the island of Puerto Rico. I will narrate the events of Irizarry's controversial artistic political actions, their trials and repercussions. As a product of rigorous archival research, I carefully reconstruct them through the compilation of newspaper articles of the years under study, press releases, and interviews to the artist and his lawyers in early 2000. Furthermore, I will briefly discuss the political and social panorama during the months leading up to the 1976 Abrazo Explosivo action and the skyjacking of a New York to San Juan bound flight in 1979. Finally, I will comment on the contradictory perceptions of these actions in the local art scene and the pro-independence movements and reflect on the actions' significance and relevance. On June 1976, President Ford informed that the continuation of the economic discussions held during November 1973 between the leaders of Japan, Great Britain, Germany, West Germany, Italy, and Canada would be held in Puerto Rico in June 27th and 28th at the Dorado Beach and Cerro Mar, luxury hotels located at the northern part of the island. The decision to hold the economic summit in Puerto Rico, made without consulting the then governor, the Puerto Rican governor, Rafael Hernández Colón, in office from 1973 to 1977, caused controversy in some sectors of the island. The imposition brought an uprising of the pro-independence parties Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño, PIP, and the Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño, PSP, who argued that this presidential act proved once again the colonial status of Puerto Rico. Both parties threatened to hold massive protests against the summit. Juan Marí Bras, PSP secretary, expressed, quote, "We warn the President of the United States that the patriotic people of Puerto Rico will manifest its repudiation of this visit repudiation of the visit that the chiefs of the principal imperialistic nations of the planet are imposing upon us," end quote. Newspapers in the island were publishing news on the hotel's remodeling project, the protests, the summit, and the summit's protocolar activities. Members of the independence and socialist parties were pointing out the blatant colonial and imperialist dynamics, like, for example, the White House almost banning the Puerto Rican flag at the summit. The situation on the island was getting tense. Born in Santa Isabel in 1938, Carlos Irrizary moved to New York with his parents when he was just 8 years old and spent the rest of his childhood and adolescent years in El Barrio. He studied graphic commercial art in the Industrial Art School, now known as the Arts and Design School of New York. At the beginning of 1960s, he enrolled in the US States Army. 3 years later, he quit the Army's art workshop and returned to Puerto Rico, where he found work as an art director in local newspapers such as El Mundo and San Juan Star. During the 60s, Irizarry produced works with clear references to pop art, hard edge, shaped canvas, fetish finish, and ambiances. Alongside Domingo Lopez de Victoria, another Puerto Rican artist who had returned from New York, they promoted avant-garde art through Galería 63, an old San Juan artist-run gallery founded by Irizarry in 1966. The Puerto Rico art scene panorama during the 1960s and 70s posed a disjunctive between figuration, abstraction, and avant-garde art. Artists of a more conservative denomination understood that figurative art reaffirmed and constructed a Puerto Rican identity. Artists and artworks have had an implied connotation with social ideology. Therefore, art is political, and art is a defiance against the USA colonial status. Therefore, Puerto Rican art equals a reaffirmation of a national identity. According to their viewpoint, that figurative art equals national consciousness, whereas abstraction or avant-garde art equals national alienation. Maybe as a reaction to this debate, by 1969, Irizarry made an abrupt change in his visual language. While living in New York from more or less 1969 to 1970, a social and political awakening tempted Irizarry to return to figurative art, and in turn, elaborated a body of work rich of social and political criticism. The Vietnam War, Puerto Rico's colonial status, and the influence of Robert Rauschenberg, Claes Oldenburg, Jasper Johns, and Andy Warhol contribute to the transformation in Irizarry's work. In 1970, Betsy Jones, curator at the Museum of Modern Art, conceived the exhibition Artists as an Adversary. Jones selected pieces related with the war and its disasters, labeling the artist as an agent of social awareness. Two of Irizarry's photo silk screens, My Son the Soldier Part 1 and Part 2, made in 1970, were included in the show and since then have been part of MoMA's permanent collection. The diptych referenced two Life magazine numbers on the Vietnam War. Irizarry appropriated the magazine's layout and photographs, thereby commenting on how images of death and war are consumed by US population, while also taking a stance against the Vietnam War. Irizarry would test the boundaries of a socially politically engaged artist on June 1976. After reading the headline, Le volaron la tapa de los sesos, in a local newspaper called El Vocero, Irizarry got the idea for his first artistic political action. He wrote a press release where he unveiled that he had explosive information regarding President Ford's visit to Puerto Rico. He then personally delivered it to the office of the different media outlets in the San Juan area. Then he made 2 phone calls to the office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, in Puerto Rico to invite them to the press conference he was summoning. One can argue that Irizarry's use of press releases to make public his intentions references tactic employed by organized groups in the struggle for independence, such as Comandos Armados de Liberación, or CAL, active from 1967, or Las Fuerzas Armadas de la Liberación Nacional, FALN, active from 1974, who sent communiques to the press to claim responsibility for bombings or robberies. Press releases and newspaper clippings reporting on Irizarry's judicial case also became part of this political and artistic action. Undoubtedly, Irizarry's day job at a print media outlet in the island was used to his advantage. He got extensive coverage in the island's media, excuse me. At 5 p.m. on June 7, 1976, Carlos Irrizary began the press conference with all the island's media in the restaurant La Fonda del Callejón in Old San Juan. He presented himself as the spokesman for the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, a symbolic movement he invented, and he revealed he was planning to volar la tapa de los sesos to President Ford. Conceptualized as a suicidal bombing, the members of the Ejército would tie explosives to their bodies and set them off while they were near the president. Irizarry commented, quote, "I just don't want him to come here. The moment he made plans to come here without first informing the governor he was coming, he was telling the world this is not a commonwealth here, but merely a colony," end quote. Irizarry indicated that if the president canceled his visit, he would abandon his plan. The president did not cancel. According to Marcos Rigau, Irizarry's defense lawyer and friend, who I quote extensively, quote, "One day, Carlos came to my office. I hadn't seen him throughout the process. He had been running in the media for several days, radio, television, written press. He was there with one of those monstrous beards, hard hair, mustache, all the paraphernalia, with his jeans and t-shirt, disguised as a terrorist, disguised as a revolutionary, or a mad artist, or both. He comes and he sits, and he says to Carlos, 'Well, fucker, what are you gonna do?' He doesn't speak to me. Then he says, 'Shit, Marcos, they won't arrest me.' That's the first things he says, 'They won't arrest me.' I tell him, 'Look, they're gonna arrest you and they're gonna put you in jail. Stop with that shit. They'll really arrest you and you throw you in jail. Stop the foolishness.' Which Carlos replied, 'I just want to know if they're gonna arrest me or not. They don't tell me anything. I go to some place and they follow me. I am being followed everywhere. They're following me, but they won't arrest me.' Rigau says, 'Look, Carlos, you wanna get arrested? This is what you have to do. You shave, you get a haircut, you wear a navy blue suit with a white shirt and a conservative tie. Disguise yourself as an executive. They will arrest you. Everybody knows you like this, and while you're not at a walking distance of the president, they will laugh at you. But if you disguise yourself, they'll arrest you," end quote. Irizarry took his lawyer's advice. He asked his wife to cut his hair and shave his beard. He wore a suit and headed over to the Dorado Beach Hotel, where a party was underway for the security agents and their wives. Irizarry entered the hotel through the beach, went to the bar, and sat before the agents that were dancing. He had some drinks and left for his house in Old San Juan. He went unnoticed by the agents in the hotel. Soon later, Irizarry was arrested by the United States Secret Service agent at his studio at Tetuan Street, Old San Juan, on June 16th, and was incarcerated with a $50,000 bail. According to Irizarry, on the morning of his first appearance at court, it was Rigau who proposed the conceptual art as a defense strategy, which he then approved. In court, the defense attorneys maintained that Irizarry's action had not been a threat as such, but rather a work of protest art within the conceptual art medium, a work that, according to the lawyers, bore the title Homenaje a los Presos Políticos. This fact was revealed after Irizarry's imprisonment, when friends of the artist sent a press release to the media outlets with the title, and was published in the weekly newspaper Claridad, the official publication of the Movimiento Pro Independencia. In front of the magistrate, this is the press release. In front of the magistrate, Irizarry entered a plea of not guilty and declaring, quote, "I am not guilty. I am acting as an artist in defense of Puerto Rico. I am a man of peace. The so-called threat constitutes as an artistic representation of my protest over Puerto Rico's colonial status. It is conceptual art, end quote. A preliminary hearing was scheduled. At the hearing, Rigau brought to the court 3 paintings, 4 art specialists as witnesses, and a 10-page memorandum explaining the basis of the defense. Irizarry is not a criminal, he is an artist. As part of the defense, of the memorandum quotes the 1973 poem Comienzo por invocar a Walt Whitman by Pablo Neruda, who resorts to his poetic artillery to judge and condemn President Nixon. These foundations, an example employed by his lawyers as defense strategies, provoke a disjunctive between how art is perceived and where it occurs. Furthermore, with these references, Rigau expects to establish that artists have utilized art as a protest medium without legal repercussions for the simple reason that the protest itself is a work of art. Artists and colleagues Felix Bonilla Norat and Joaquín Mercado served as witness to the defense. Both declared they knew Irizarry's intention to produce a conceptual art piece. Bonilla Norat noted that, quote, at the end of the artistic work would probably be the appearance of Carlos Irrizary, where Ford would arrive. Irizarry would wear a belt with what seemed to be dynamite sticks, but they would really be tubes filled with rice and beans, contraceptive pills, copies of the newspaper and San Juan Star, pages of the Sears catalog, etc. End quote. The strategy seemed to have worked. Irizarry was released from prison under his own custody on July 2nd, 1976, merely 2 days after the economic summit ended. On August 13, 1976, the federal judge Juan Pérez Jiménez dismissed the charges due to technical faults of the offense. District Attorney Julio Morales claimed to be waiting for FBI documents to officially charge Irizarry. Bonilla Norat commented, quote, "It would have made good theater, but they gave us no stage," end quote. Once free, Irizarry produced a photo silkscreen titled United States of America versus Carlos Irizarry. In it, Irizarry recreated the front page of the San Juan Star newspaper, which informed the public on Irizarry's conceptual art defense at trial. As part of its composition, Irizarry included the motion to dismiss, the one I'm pointing out with my cursor, his lawyer Marcos Rigau filed in the court proceedings. Once again, the artist appropriated images from print media as a source material for his works, a contemplation on how information circulates and is consumed. With the 1976 feat completed, Carlos Irizarry begins the gestation of the intention that will culminate in the intellectual production of the symbolic act known as the skyjacking of the American Airlines Kikiriki flight of 1979. This action has been debated in the art scene, yet besides the dramatics of the action, it promulgates doubt on the artist's intentions. Is it a political act or is it a work of art? Before discussing Irizarry's skyjacking, it must be noted that after the Cuban Revolution, hundreds of planes were hijacked. Flight plans were changed so that they landed in Jose Marti Airport in Havana, Cuba. Close to 450 skyjackings occurred between 1960 and 1980. As a consequence of the numerous skyjackings in the period, airlines resorted to the magnetometers and sky marshals to prevent these acts. The following remarks took place between March 7, 1979, the day Andrés Figueroa Cordero died, and August 15th, Irizarry's arrest. I will resort to a very lengthy quote by Irizarry, which sheds light on the detailed planning of said action. Quote, Andrés Figueroa Cordero was set free because of his cancer. The day I finished his portrait, I was signing it and heard the news on the radio that he had died. I held an exhibition at the Colegio de Abogados in his honor. I planned the act there. I gave all my properties to my ex-wife, Mirna Oliver. I left with a bag containing few clothes. This bag with electric cables was the bomb. I stayed at the Capitol Hotel next to El Colegio, where I wrote the letter to President Carter. If you don't free the nationalist prisoners, the Liberation Army of Puerto Rico will blow up an American Airlines plane. I made copies of the letter at the Colegio de Abogados. A week later, I finished the poster design for the Bar Association, got paid the hotel, and took a taxi to the Vieques ferry. I stayed at a guest house in La Esperanza. In the morning, I got on the Vieques airlink to the Luis Muñoz Marin Airport so that nobody, meaning the FBI, would see me leave for Washington. I arrived at Washington and stayed at the National Hotel. The next day, I went to the Washington Post building and used the telephone in the lobby to call the newspaper and said, there is an explosive message in the telephone booth. I left a copy of the letter for President Carter and went to the J. Edgar Hoover FBI building. Across the street, there was a telephone I used to call the FBI and give the same message. With the sound of the sirens in Washington, I left for the Greyhound bus station to the Newark, New Jersey airport, where I called the FBI again. I stayed in a hotel in Newark, and next morning I went to Manhattan. I went to the New York Daily News lobby and repeated the explosive message over the phone. United Nations is across the street, so I entered and left a copy of the letter at the information desk. I got in a taxi and left for the JFK airport, boarded the American Airlines Kikiriki 11:45 p.m. flight filled with Puerto Ricans, end quote. Irizarry sat at the last row of the airplane next to the bathrooms. He had taken tranquilizers before boarding. 30 minutes into the flight, Irizarry handed a flight attendant an envelope with a message that said, quote, Captain, this is an explosive message for President Carter, end quote. The captain thought the envelope contained a bomb and decided to return to New York and landed on a deserted area in the JFK. After a while, a dozen armed agents, undercover New York police officers, and FBI agents entered the plane. They took the bag with electric cables, which had dirty clothes, and placed them in an anti-bomb truck. Irizarry was questioned at the national headquarters about the macheteros and the fallen, and arrested and sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. Bail was set for $500,000. The next day, he faced the United States District Judge Thomas C. Platt, who presided the Eastern District of New York and had experience in skyjacking cases. The court appointed a U.S. Latino attorney, Julio Morales, for his defense, yet Irizarry suspected Morales was an agent and asked Rigau to be his attorney on the case. Contrary to the 1976 case, this was not dismissed. Irizarry's threat was considered as a serious act against the United States and would go to trial. Presumably, at the beginning of the legal process, Judge Platt had agreed to accept the defense's strategy of arguing the action as a conceptual work of art. Nonetheless, the judge changed his mind when, according to Irizarry, quote, Marco intimidates the judge by stating he'd bring Salvador Dali and other famous artists from New York, end quote, to the trial. Fearing the trial would turn into a circus, the court came to an agreement with the defense. A possible motivation for the skyjacking, I propose, could be linked to Irizarry's 1979 exhibition in homage to the Puerto Rican political prisoners incarcerated since 1954. Art critic for San Juan Star, Mina Rodriguez, published When an Homage is Not a Homage, a review of the show, and the review of the show was harsh. She commented on Irizarry's deliberate use of facial distortion, stating, quote, the way the artist has emphasized this negative side of the patriots contradicts his purpose of an homage to them, end quote. Was the skyjacking also an effort to mend the failed homage exhibit? Irizarry's demand for his 1979 skyjacking was the immediate liberation of the Puerto Rican political prisoners who, on March 1st, 1954, opened fire on the US Congress floor while shouting, Viva Puerto Rico Libre. They were indicted, tried, convicted in federal court for their actions, and received sentences up to 75 years in federal prison. Less than a month after Irizarry's arrest, President Carter pardoned Lolita Lebron, Irving Flores, and Rafael Miranda, who were freed after being incarcerated for 25 years. Irizarry served a 4-year imprisonment sentence and 2 years probation. As a result of these actions, Irizarry's figure was mythologized. His actions were urban legends for both the art scene and members of the National Independence Party movement. Articles published on local newspapers announcing Irizarry's return to the island were accompanied with photographic portraits of the artist, once again dressed as a rebel or revolutionary, or even a superstar with his long hair and thick, long beard. The mythos created by these actions is defended as works of art by some, while others underrate the actions because of the defense based on conceptual art employed in the trial. Art scene in Puerto Rico has difficulties visualizing that an artist so knowledgeable in the avant-garde movements had not formulated these actions as art, for they possess all the characteristics of conceptual art. On the other hand, contrary to the political prisoners he supported, in his legal defense, Irizarry denies his actions being revolutionary. He therefore interrupts the idea of patriotic sacrifice and places art first, displacing the independence struggle to a second priority. Irizarry's actions exist in the intersection between art and political activism, using conceptual art as ammunition against Puerto Rico's colonial status under US imperialist rule. But at the same time, it proposes a reflection on what constitutes as Puerto Rican art. Puerto Rican artists active in the 1950s created images which speak directly against the colonial status in the island, for example, Carlos Raquel Rivera's linoleum print, Elecciones Coloniales, made in 1959. Raquel Rivera's political and ideological integrity has never been questioned. Furthermore, as an artist, he was praised for his technical mastery and, above all, his political anti-colonial theme. Irizarry, on the other hand, had to navigate different waters since his actions blurred the line between art and political art, or life and political art. His politically charged avant-garde works had real consequences, imprisonment. Yet his ideology and commitment to the liberation of Puerto Rico were questioned. What is clear is that depending through which lens they are observed, be it in legal proceedings, the artistic or nationalistic ideology, which has a more conservative appreciation of their art and what constitutes as art, it clearly defines the actions in separate categories, almost never understood as a result of a complex power dynamic between empire, colony, metropolis, periphery, and boundaries between life and art. As Irizarry said, and I quote, "Para las autoridades, yo siempre fui un preso político peligroso y un terrorista. Y eso no fue un proceso simbólico. Nadie en la prisión me trató como un artista. Estando en prisión, yo nunca me sentí como un artista. Yo siempre me sentí como un preso político. El juez y las autoridades consideraron el skyjacking como un acto criminal y terrorista. Yo lo considero como un acto de liberación. We are freedom fighters. Nosotros no somos terroristas. Ellos son los que confunden las cosas. Bajo them." Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa and Amalia and Rachel. I'm Josh Franco. It's great to be here. And thank you, Che and Jaime and the organizers for pairing me with this particular group. It speaks to a lot of the things I'm passionate about and interested in. Those things in this case being intimacy and archives. So I'm gonna keep my comments briefer than I planned because we are over time. But to summarize, Amalia and Rachel, you both began your papers and not with artworks, but with very intimate spaces. One, that beautiful photograph of the party in Antúnez's Bank Street apartment, Amalia, and Rachel with Nuñez's really prosaic account of what it was like to walk through the city and to be. And Melissa, by the end of reading the draft and hearing it again today, I think you really put us inside the awkwardness of Irizary's kind of shifting framework for his actions. Is it politics? Is it art? When is it convenient to be one or the other? So thank you for that. And so, I'm here at the Archives of American Art. I'm fortunate to be in my office, actually. So I wanted to take advantage of that and, share some sort of archival documents that respond, directly to the issues raised in this presentation. So I initially went first to look for Nemesio Antúnez in our collections here at the archives, and discovered one folder in the Stanton L. Catlin papers, went to it, and then learned from this slip, of course, we track all of our documents very carefully, and Amalia, you've already requested this for digitization, and I believe you've received it by now. So I'm not going to scoop you by reading that very dense letter that Catlin wrote to Nuñez that is a really interesting summary, of his interpretation of Chilean art in New York as a group, and particularly speaking to Irizary's. I look forward to seeing what you do with that letter. So then I did, coincidentally, while I was thinking about this, in reading your papers last week and this week, I, for a separate task, was spending a lot of time in Jaime Davidovich's papers, who of course has a lot of relevance here in this conference. And before I get to those couple of goodies, I just want to point to a line that Rachel wrote, but I think applies to all three of these papers. Rachel, you just put it very succinctly and very well. Quote, "Their artworks display an ambivalence and uneasiness toward their new home. These feelings, however, were countered by the community that they built together." And that's, I think, something that characterizes, many Latin American artists to New York and many immigrant artists to the US, period, from around the globe, is that sense of both belonging and not belonging, enjoying the place you are and also despising the place you are, because it's kind of the reason you're there sometimes forcefully. So I was looking through Jaime's papers and thinking about it, and I just want to share, in response to your generosity, share some things from our collection, two things, just quickly. In Jaime's papers, there's a folder, a photo album that has, I would love to see all your faces if you want to turn your cameras on. Thank you, Che. There's this beautiful photo album that our processing archivists have lovingly deconstructed, interleaved with acid-free paper, all that kind of good thing. But I just want to give you and the audience this view of these beautiful photographs of Jaime's probably first or very early apartment in New York City in 1964. It's just great. And again, because of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but it is a whole photo album in this folder. And much like those, the photos, you showed at the beginning, Amalia, really illuminate the social worlds of Latin American artists in New York. And then I want to read quickly, from the typescript of Jaime's memoirs that exist in his papers. I don't know if they've been published in any version or not. There are people on this call, Brian Bentley, I know you're out there, who will know if they've been published. But I think it's just sort of beautifully captures, and it's another account about a Latin American artist in New York, in this case, Jaime. So just you can see the typescript. I mean, it's just a typed piece of paper, but Jaime did it, so it's nice. So New York, the early years. I arrived in New York for the first week of December 1963. It was cold. I came with 2 bolsones. I stayed in Woodside, Queens. My sister had an apartment there. I was allowed to stay in an open bed. I bought an unpainted dresser. I started looking for a job almost as soon as I arrived. First, I had to get my green card. A cousin from my mother's family who worked at the US government was my affidavit. I went to Washington to visit the cousin. He organized a show of my work in Virginia. I did all the paintings in the basement of my cousin's house. In New York, it was very difficult to get a show. All my friends used to get together at Jackie Barnett's, an American interested in Latin American art. I visited Bonabardi in Paris on Paris Street. Borache from the Galleria Rubbers came a few times to New York and we became friends. The Argentinian artists were congregating around the Bonino Gallery in 57th Street. And I really want to read the whole page. I plan to, but I'll stop there. It is fully digitized on the Archives of American website, so please go there and read it. And it's really nice to invoke Jaime's voice a little bit. So my questions for you that I would love to hear you respond to are, less about exactly what you presented today and more about your experience as an archive. So you've put us all in these very intimate spaces. So I want to think about and invite you to think about the intimate space of the archive and your own research experiences. And questions that I think about often in my work, is the context of a collection. So, Amalia and Rachel, you both use the Nemesio Antúnez Foundation papers, which I understand are in Santiago, so physically in Chile. Amalia, I think I'll ask you to talk about those a little bit more in your experience researching them. Because Rachel, I would love to hear from you about the Guillermo Nuñez papers, which I didn't catch. I don't think I got a sense of physically where they're located or who's in charge of them. But understanding that would be great. And then Melissa, I think it's always fascinating, press clippings and journalism as archival documents are really interesting because it is a primary source, but not something like Jaime's unpublished manuscript or other things, or correspondence. So I wonder how you thought about the challenge of thinking, taking into account the possible biases of the journalists or the publications that you were working. And then just physically, where were you looking at all these things is always helpful. I think these questions really illuminate the topics themselves when you learn about how the researcher, you guys, encountered them and engaged with them. So I'll stop there. We're at 4:30, but Jay sent a note. We have a few minutes, so maybe we can just get through this round. So we'll just go in order. Amalia, if you want to go first.
Okay, thank you for the question and for show the archives, that wonderful papers. I want to say that for all the researchers, and there are many very good archives right now in Chile. For the last years, so many people are working on the archive, Nuñez, Antúnez. In my case, I am working since the beginning in the archive of Antúnez Foundation. Federico Breda is the archivist in the director of the architectural system for the archive. So it's amazing that working with these documents, especially I would like the oral history. So for me, these audio files are crucial, are very important to build and write a new or different history of art. So, and I really recommend that listening and using this audio file you can find in the website. So there are many artists and art historians and other people who it's very interesting. So only I can say that for today. Thank you.
Thanks. Rachel?
Thank you so much for your questions and your comments and sharing these great archival sources. And this is a perfect question, I think, for me to follow Amalia, because I have not been to Santiago. And I have been able to access these archives because of the great digitization projects that have gone on. And you may have noticed, if you were looking with an eagle eye, that many of my works from the Fundación Nemesio Antúnez had watermarks, whereas Amalia's didn't. So, I love being in the archives and thinking about the intimacy of that space, but especially having conducted this research over the past couple of years when travel hasn't been a possibility, it's great to just sort of have that access to begin exploring through material. And of course, it's not the same as holding it in your hands, but it's something that I'm looking forward to. In terms of the Archivo Guillermo Nuñez, the digital archive was launched right around the time that LACMA acquired our paintings. So it was a really nice sort of correspondence and kickoff for me to be able to start this research. And it's in Santiago. Guillermo Nuñez is involved. And just to bring it up a little bit to the present day, as I was preparing this presentation, the Carlos Irrizary archive was just launched online, I believe last week. So I was able to grab that great image of him on a rooftop to go with my series of artists on rooftops in New York. You know, just that access has been really great. And yeah, it only like deepens my interest and want to get to the archives in person as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, in person can't be replaced, but digitization's really saved us the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Melissa?
Yes, hi. Most of my research was at Biblioteca Lázaro in University of Puerto Rico, just, microfilms. There isn't, in Puerto Rico now, there's kind of this conscious of building archives. So artists usually didn't keep anything. And since a lot of them moved, or because of the humidity in Puerto Rico, or because of hurricanes, things kind of, go missing. So, but I did get to speak to Irizarry before he passed away on 2017, and I got to interview him. But he didn't like talking about those actions per se. So it was kind of difficult. So as difficult as it is to read between the lines in each of the editorial lines of each newspaper, he was also kind of difficult with speaking about these actions. Yeah.
The awkwardness. So I was right. Like I felt it. You conveyed it very well, subtly, but very well. So while we wait for other questions to come in, another thing I think about archives often, and this can be kind of a conceptual exercise, and Melissa, the most intense conversations I have in this context are with Puerto Rican artists for good reason. But the national context of an archive and of an institution. So for instance, what would it mean if Antúnez, Nuñez papers, Irizarry's, were, for instance, ultimately housed here at the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian, with all the meaning for nationalism and pride that sort of conveys, and what does it mean to keep it in its home territory? Like there are certainly advantages to having the papers Antúnez stay in Chile. And this is something I don't have clear feelings about, and every artist who I speak with, or family of artists I speak with, it's like the conversation's different. And sometimes the decision is for papers to stay in a certain territory. So, they're not free-floating things, and they're tied to land and place. And I would just love to hear a little bit about that. And then I think we're gonna move on to the wonderful Yasmin. Well, we do have a question from the audience. So I can put my question aside for Jaime, who wants to make a comment question. It's quite beautiful how all these presentations emphasize one way or another the role of affect and emotions when going through archives and going through the past. Exactly. We art historians try to reconstruct this period, and so much gets lost in the translation of time. To hear the voice of young Martha Minuhin almost made me cry. The effort to imagine Irizarry's political passion through his testimonies. How do you feel about these aspects in your research? Feelings in the archives.
Oh, I absolutely agree with the comment of the beautiful and all the different kind of affection, especially in the voice. I think is particularly because obviously in the press or maybe in the letters, or always is maybe you can interpret the calligraphy of the author, but the voice is not usual work with the voice. So I think is it like an invitation to really work with other affection, like the express the personality. For me, it's wonderful. I am really happy to work with these sound archives.
And they play really well in a PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Rachel?
Yeah, I would add on to that too. I did not have voice, but being able to find also that video. The video does have a musical soundtrack, but I had muted it for sort of in the interest of time to be able to speak over it. But, you know, having again, sort of those documents and artworks that are shown in the video brought to life through film was a really exciting way to engage with the material. And I think also sort of going to the original question, just the feeling of being in the archives. I often find myself getting distracted by all the social aspects that pop up in letters. And it's just, you know, great to be able to piece that all together.
Yeah, archives are just giant cheese made boxes. Melissa, do you have any last comment before we move on?
Yeah, just adding on to what Amalia was saying, when I spoke to Carlos, maybe 2014, there's also the body language and the looks, and that just, you know, things can be said without being said. And so how we interpret that is also kind of fun and intriguing, and just be able to speak to the artist and get it, you know, right from the horse's mouth, no, is also quite fascinating. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, you're all welcome in DC anytime, and congratulations on these great papers. So everyone stay on, because immediately we're rolling into a keynote by the brilliant Yasmin Ramirez. I'm looking forward to that, and thank you all. See you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Josh, Amalia, Rachel, everybody. That was a beautiful panel, a wonderful day. And it is my pleasure. I'm sad that we are soon gonna be finishing this amazing gathering. It's been such a pleasure to hear you all, and I wish we were in person and we could keep talking over a drink after this. But I hope that everybody can raise a glass after Jasmine's presentation, and we can celebrate for this artist and all the effort of studying this period. But before that, we're going to close with Jasmine Ramirez, who is an art worker, curator, and writer based in New York. She holds a PhD in art history from the Graduate Center CUNY at the City University of New York. She is born in Brooklyn and was active in the downtown art scene in the early 80s as a club kid and art critic for the East Village Eye. Attracted to street art and hip hop, she became acquainted with emerging artists and writers, many of whom are now icons of the 1980s. Currently an independent curator, Dr. Ramirez has collaborated on curatorial projects with the Bronx Museum, El Museo del Barrio, the Lois Aida Center, the New Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, Franklin Furnace, and Taller Boricua. So thank you, Jasmine. Looking forward to hearing you.
Buenas tardes, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Can you hear me? Yeah, hear me well enough. Okay, so let's get on with the program. I loved all. I have just been in awe with the conference. I tuned in yesterday and today. It's been absolutely wonderful. I'm also so appreciative of the exhibition that's going on right now, parts 1 and 2, precisely because as being from the Puerto Rican diaspora, artists here, and Puerto Rico in general, I think, you know, especially in the prior to postmodernism, let's say, we had always suffered an ambiguous identity. On the one hand, Puerto Rico sits in the middle of the Caribbean, and we are at the crossroads of the United States and Latin America and Africa, among other things. But because of our political status as a colonized people, we also don't always fit very well either in the United States or in Latin America. Some people may not think that we're understood as being part of the Caribbean, but but not apart because of that we are in territory of the United States. So although we've often had the potential to be so many things, too often we don't fit into any neat category and are therefore tossed out, which brings me to why, in fact, we had to have a Puerto Rican art movement here in New York, and a little bit about the importance of 1969 as the starting point. So let me start sharing my screen. Share screen. We're gonna go right here. Okay, share. And I actually wanna start out with this image that some of you may be familiar with, and it's in tribute to an essay called Magnet New York, which brought this show to my attention. And it is a photo of Joanne Woodward and Paul Newman at an opening on 57th Street of this exhibition of Latin American art. And
Jasmine,
yes.
Just a second. Can you put your PowerPoint in full screen?
I can try. Like this?
No, on the bottom towards the left. No.
No?
Bottom.
View. We can try.
At the bottom there, enter full screen.
The
View.
bottom?
No, not this, towards the left. No, a little bit more towards the left.
It says I'm at, I can't really do it. Like this? No, nope.
No, yes, right there. No.
That way?
Yes.
You want it that way?
I think that works. Yeah.
Maybe it works for you.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you.
Yes. So this essay written by Carlos Stellwig really set 1964 as at least the start in some ways of real recognition of Latin American artists in New York. But within that exhibition, there were no Puerto Rican artists, which is not to say that there weren't very important artists working at that time in the New York art world. But they were sort of missing in plain sight. So we have, for example, Olga Albizu, an abstract painter who came to New York in the 1940s. And in my opinion, is one of the most famous unknown Puerto Rican artists, given that her paintings graced the cover of all of those wonderful Verve albums. She sort of became the face of Afro-Brazilian music in a way, or at least the artwork that exemplified the cool jazz sound of the Afro-Brazilian Stan Getz, João Gilberto collaboration. And these records, at least were in my home as a child, I remember, and were probably collected throughout the world. But yet, she remains very much an under-recognized artist at that time and today. Rafael Ferrer, who's not familiar with Rafael Ferrer? Well, he was certainly working in New York in the 1960s, and by 1969 was in the Whitney Museum Anti-Illusion Procedures and Materials Show. But you would basically have to know that he was Puerto Rican at the time. It wasn't that he was hiding his ethnicity, but but I would say that there really wasn't in the 1960s still in New York a movement to represent Puerto Rican art as Puerto Rican art. Rather, there were artists of what I would say of Puerto Rican descent who were making very important contributions to the art world in New York at that time, and Rafael Ferrer fits into that kind of category. And of course, we saw before Carlos Irrizary. Carlos Irizarry, this is a moratorium, 1969. Carlos Irrizary was another artist. He's actually born in Puerto Rico, but was raised here in New York and was going back and forth between the island and Puerto Rico. And in part, I think, as a result of the racism that he faced here in New York, living within the belly of the beast, and his principled stance against US colonialism, he decided, in fact, that he would make his mark on the island. So even though he was actually doing work that was very similar to the New York School pop-based work, that was also quite political, this is anti the Vietnam War, he did not stay when our movement, the Nuyorican movement, began to blossom in 1969. And Ralph Ortiz, of course, by the early 1960s, one of the founders of the destruction movement. This is Archaeological Find number 9, 1964. This is him destroying a piano in the destruction conference in London. At the time, in 1969, though, Ralph, as he was known as Ralph Ortiz and not Rafael Ortiz, as he later changed his name or again, to reflect his desire to really come out and declare himself both as an avant-garde artist, but as a Puerto Rican artist, and was the founder of El Museo del Barrio. Now, all of these artists in the 1960s are working in New York or going between the island and New York, making their mark. But the young artists who would found the movement didn't know them at the time. And I asked Ralph, was he aware? Did he know Ralph Ortiz? Did he know Carlos Irrizary? And he said no, that at that time, he really didn't know any other Puerto Rican artists. And when I talked to the artists who founded the movement, they felt the same way. So 1969 is year zero in the history of the Puerto Rican art movement in New York, AKA the Nuyorican art movement. During this pivotal year, an interconnected group of Puerto Rican artist activists involved in organizations such as the Young Lords Party, the Puerto Rican Art Workers Coalition, Taller Boricua, and El Museo del Barrio joined forces to demand equity, empowerment, visibility for disenfranchised Black and Brown residents living in the city's marginalized barrios. Applying their skills to uplift their communities, these artists transformed areas once stigmatized as slums, war zones, and industrial wastelands into vibrant neighborhoods where art exhibits, mural making, poetry readings, and performance art became part of the fabric of daily life. So what I'm showing you here refers to this first exhibition since 1957 of Puerto Rican artists in New York, and it was organized by Henry Ghent at the Brooklyn Museum in January 1969. January 1969 was a hot month in the New York art world. On January 3rd, the artist Takis removed his sculpture from the galleries of the Museum of Modern Art to protest that the museum had not obtained his permission to display it. And I will show you that. A week later, over 75 artists formed the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition to protest the exclusion of African-American fine artists and curators from Harlem on My Mind, a multimedia exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And on January 14th, curator and BEECC activist Henry Ghent, he was part of the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, held an opening celebration for the first exhibition of Puerto Rican art to take place in the New York City Museum since 1957. Held in the Brooklyn Museum's Community Gallery, Contemporary Puerto Rican Artists was a showcase for emerging Puerto Rican artists who were enrolled in the city's fine art colleges, notably Pratt Institute and the School of Visual Arts. Marcos Dimas credits participating in the Brooklyn Museum show with spurring him and fellow art students, Adrian Garcia, Martin Rubio, and Armando Soto, to continue working together on increasing the visibility of Puerto Rican culture. Myself, Adrian, Armando, and Martin, we were like white on rice after the Brooklyn show, recalled Dimas. Anything that was happening, we were there. And what I want to also point to you is that the art that was on display, contemporary Puerto Rican artists, also didn't necessarily look like anything we would identifiably call Puerto Rican. That is because Marcos and other of the artists at the time explained to me that there was no real way of connecting with Puerto Rican culture in the New York City schools, and that they were in fact discouraged from making so-called ethnic art. And what I'm showing you right here, there are some photos of the exhibit, which also included Tony Bacharra, who is a very well-known abstract artist, and also for many, many years, one of the trustees at El Museo del Barrio, a very well-respected artist in New York. This is Marcos's contribution to the show, and significantly, he titled this painting Portrait of the Artist as an Invisible Man, because he told me that he felt, as a Puerto Rican artist, invisible. And that is also what the writer of this article from Puerto Rico, who came to see the show, said, una fecunda beta de artistas desconocidos. Artist, you know, a bountiful expression of artists, of unknown artists. And within this essay that she wrote, a review of the show, she talks about how the exhibition came about. In fact, because Henry Ghent was African-American, had wanted to put a Puerto Rican artist in a group show of other Brooklyn artists, and the other artists objected to having a Puerto Rican in the exhibition. And he decided that, wow, I've never seen an exhibition of Puerto Rican artists. I'm going to actually create one so that we can begin to see what this community, which has been marginalized as the African community had been for decades. So it really comes about, this exhibition, as a response to a great deal of racism that artists were feeling at the time and experiencing. So that's the Problem on My Mind protest at the Met, which made a great deal of change in the art world, got quite a bit of attention, Dakis. And after Dakis, this protest, there emerges the Art Workers Coalition, which was a coalition of artist activists who were involved in an emerging desire for artist rights, for in diversity and inclusion in the art world, and also anti-war activism. And they begin to meet, and one of the places that they meet, as you can see, is in the School of Visual Arts, where Marcos and Adrian and Armando Soto, who were part of that exhibition, were also enrolled. And so they begin to sort of hear about this kind of activism going on. And they're still art students. And so he said, well, we really didn't go to the first year of meetings, but we knew that they were going on. What they were interested in attending, the person who did attend was Rafael Montañez Ortiz, who at that time was not only doing his destruction art work, but was also in the process of founding El Museo del Barrio. Ralph Ortiz, although he was quite successful, worked daily as a teacher in the High School of Art and Design. And one of the things that, when I talked to him about his career, I asked him, I said, Ralph, you were in London and you were doing all these interesting things and you were a part of the Judson Church. I mean, why didn't you have a dealer? Why were you teaching in high school? And he said, well, I thought it was very bourgeois of me to just dedicate my sit around in a studio. I wanted to make a difference. And the other thing that he revealed to me was that when he was a young man, he wanted to go to music and art high school, but his guidance counselor basically told him that he could not go there. And he was sent to a vocational school instead. So he said that made a real difference in his perspective, even from a young age, knowing that he was denied or deterred, let's say, by structural racism against going to art school, even though he definitely had the talent to be there. And he wanted to go to a school and become a mentor to other young people so that they could see someone like themselves on the faculty. And El Museo del Barrio was born from that desire as well to create a center for Puerto Rican artists and art to be seen on a consistent basis. In 1969 as well, we have the emergence of the Young Lords Party. And that was founded by a group of college-age Puerto Rican students, first generation. Among them is Juan Gonzalez, Pablo Yoruba Guzman, Felipe Luciano, and Denise Oliver. And their activism really, which involves taking over museums, creating newspapers, being on the radio, taking over public institutions to demand equal rights and dignity for Puerto Rican people, really becomes very well represented in the media. So here's Denise Oliver, who was the Young Lords Minister of Economic Development, but she was also the party artist. The Young Lords were like a counterpart of the Black Panther Party, and similar to Emery, who was a Black Panther artist. So Denise designed many of the posters for the Young Lords Party. She's also someone else who's basically not seen in art history. She was of African-American descent, but nonetheless, because she said that she grew up around Puerto Ricans, she felt very comfortable belonging to the party. Another person who was part of an important part of the Young Lords was Pedro Pietri, who became the poet laureate. His Puerto Rican obituary, which I would love to play for you, but I think it might be a little difficult. And Hiram Maristani, the late Hiram Maristani, was a Young Lords Party photographer. And here you see someone holding up the Young Lords Party newspaper, which was the way that the Young Lords disseminated their information, but also how they made money, because they really never wanted to take funding, public funding from any entities, because they felt that that would compromise their party. So in 1969, in July of 1969, the Young Lords, they begin activism in El Barrio. And what I'm showing you here is that that activism was also artistic. This is a recreation. Here is Juan Gonzalez in the Young Lords Party offices in El Barrio. And this is a recreation of that by the contemporary artist, Miguel Luciano. And what I wanna show you is that in fact, the Young Lords Party offices were also included posters from the 1950s and 60s in Puerto Rico that were not necessarily created to be political at that time, but within the context of being next to Pedro Albizu's camp, this poster by Antonio Martorell of Pedro Albizu's Campos, and this small portrait of Betances. They become part of this new vocabulary, new iconography that in many ways represents the Puerto Rican proletariat as the vanguard of the party. So it's interesting to me when people from some young artists from Puerto Rico, I remember when I was at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, she wondered, why did I have a fondness for posters created by Rafael Tufino and some of the posters from the 50s, which by that time in Puerto Rico were seen as too folkloric. And I said, well, you don't understand. We were seeing them within the context of the Young Lords Party iconography, of the Black Panther iconography, so that someone, you know, this farmer becomes a symbol for us of Puerto Rican resistance, of a Black Puerto Rican, because we're reading it in a completely different way than perhaps these posters were originally intended. And here was the first action, the Young Lords Garbage Offensive, in which the Young Lords, because they would not pick up garbage in East Harlem often, they had and they asked for garbage to be picked up. They asked the sanitation department to just give them brooms, and they would begin to pick up the garbage in the neighborhood. When they were refused, they set the garbage cans in the middle of the street and caused a traffic jam to draw attention to the unequal treatment of Puerto Rican and Black neighborhoods in the city. This, of course, drew a lot of media attention. And that is how young people like Marcos Dimas began to become much more radicalized and think, yes, if I'm going to make a difference, I want to go to El Barrio. They were actually, none of them were living in El Barrio at the time, but El Barrio, as sort of the cradle of the Puerto Rican diaspora, becomes in the 1960s a site of political activism to reclaim this part of the city that had become so neglected, precisely because it was seen as a Black and Puerto Rican neighborhood. In 1969, they have a takeover of the Methodist Church after the pastor refuses to give that group the right to run a free breakfast program in the city. This became a film by that occupation of the church became a film by Third World Newsreel. And I'll see if in the end I might play it, but I want to get through this presentation for you. It is at that occupation that Pedro Pietri recites the Puerto Rican obituary, which becomes an anthem of this movement. And in general, what I can tell you about why this becomes so important is that unlike other populations in Latin America who may have come here, especially artists, let's just say, unlike artists who are coming here from Latin America to really make their mark in the city, our migration to the United States was intended for us to serve as a low-wage working population. In other words, they didn't say to Puerto Rico, to Puerto Ricans, oh, we're going to come here and you're going to, rise to the top. It was orchestrated between the United States and the government of Puerto Rico to send low-wage workers to basically fill jobs in factories and restaurants, to become dishwashers and seamstresses. And that kind of low expectation for this population was very much felt by young people who were wondering, why aren't we going to be getting ahead in life? Why do we feel that there is no future for us? Because the messages to Puerto Ricans at that time was stay in your lane, stay in your place. And your place is as a low-wage worker. So by a year passes, and by 1970, Marcos Dimas and the other founders of Tayal Boricua, the future founders of Tayal Boricua, have joined with Ralph Ortiz and begin to do demonstrations with African Americans, and it's known as the Black and Puerto Rican Art Workers Coalition, a subset of the Art Workers Coalition. And here they're doing a protest to demand that the Museum of Modern Art open a wing known as the Pedro Albizus Campos Martin Luther King wing that would showcase Black and Puerto Rican art. And of course, that did not happen, but they tried. This was a process for about 3 days. And eventually, Taller Boricua is founded in a building across the street from the Young Lords. So 1970, in a year. So we're going from a year, let's say, between Marcos Dimas and other young artists believing or feeling that they don't have a voice or an identity to actually founding their own arts collective in the middle of El Barrio and taking place daily, researching their culture. So it's at this time where they're looking at Taino imagery. They're looking at Afro-Puerto Rican masks, and they're making a new aesthetic that merges pop and traditional folkloric work and pre-Columbian imagery and Black imagery. So you've got the African, the Taino, and just basically pop art that they're also interested in exploring. And this is one of the first things that the group does is here, Rafael Tufino joins them, a very revered artist from Puerto Rico, joins this young fledgling group because he sees them very much in tune with what was going on in Puerto Rico in the 1950s, when some of the artists began to create posters in Puerto Rico. And this is a poster for a Young Lords protest for Puerto Rican independence at the UN. So that's the first poster that was created at Taller Boricua. And what happens after that is that there is a great deal of exchange, I think, not in terms of doing demonstrations or attending each other's events necessarily, because the Young Lords really saw themselves as a radical party, and these artists wanted to very much dedicate themselves to their artwork at the time. But looking at Palante, this was the first time, the newspaper produced by the Young Lords, that we got to see a little bit of Puerto Rican history. For example, know who the Puerto Rican political prisoners were, Lolita Lebron's, and Marcos creates, based on looking at this photo, a new poster that ignites a consistent demand in the 1970s and 80s to free Puerto Rican political prisoners who were activists in the fight for the independence of Puerto Rico. Here is another by Marcos Dimas. It was a poster that he had made about the abolitionists, Betances, that was reproduced in the Palante newspaper. And this is a poster by Jorge Soto, who really was one of the great artists, the late Jorge Soto of Taller Boricua, kind of demonstrating this new aesthetic that merges the Taino imagery with also African-American and also with Afro-diasporic imagery, but as well right here, you can see also the influence of graffiti as well. These are the kind of bubble letters that you would see on the street. So they're really taking from a lot of different sources. This is just more of the work that is going on. Soto, I was also looking very closely at works by Wilfredo Lam, early oceanic work. Taller artists often said that their favorite place to visit at the museum of the Metropolitan Museum was, of course, at that time was still called Primitive Art, where the halls of primitive art, where they could see works from Africa and Latin America and Oceania. Another important part of the practice at Taller Boricua was inviting the community in, teaching art classes. So you see here that it has, free art classes for young people. So education was always a very, very important part of the pedagogy and continues to be at Tayel and also at El Museo del Barrio. And here is El Museo del Barrio, 1970s. By 1972, Malta Moreno Vega had taken over the institution as director and really found a home for it, first in a brownstone gallery and after on 3rd Avenue. And this is 1974, the Art Heritage of Puerto Rico, which was an early and very, very important sort of coup for the Puerto Rican art movement in New York, which involved El Museo del Barrio, collaborating with the Metropolitan Museum and institutions in Puerto Rico to present 500 years of Puerto Rican art in New York City. This I think still remains one of the largest exhibitions of Puerto Rican art ever to have taken place in the United States. It really created new understanding and respect for Puerto Rican art, and a real sense of history, of the rich history of the island. And that is also something really important, because what sometimes is forgotten in terms of how Puerto Ricans were seen is that if you look at anthropological studies, we were pegged as the culture of poverty. That is a sort of a way in which our community was stigmatized. And what I love about this movement and why I study it is not only because I'm Puerto Rican, that I was actually on track to do Afro-diasporic or even an African-American subject as my dissertation, but I began to really admire the way that this group of artists didn't leave El Barrio, but decided to stay there and demonstrate that even if you're poor, you have great culture. And that is the dignity of daily life, the fact that the poor can create art. So the idea in this movement wasn't, I'm in El Barrio. In fact, it went opposite. It's like they began at the Brooklyn Museum and go back to El Barrio and kind of stayed there and raised the level of art in El Barrio rather than going to 57th Street or wanting to be shown in commercial galleries. And so what I want to end with really is that this movement, more and more artists, because there was money at that time in the 1970s, rent was low, but also the NEA and many other granting institutions were giving money for artist spaces, is that Puerto Ricans actually created a great deal of art spaces, artist-run spaces in New York. One of them is, of course, the New Rican Village, which was a fantastic place for performance art. Pedro Pietri and former young lord Eddie Figueroa began that space. Cayman Gallery Mocha, I'm sure that many, which was in Soho, and many of the artists that are in the exhibition now had shown at Cayman Gallery, which was a Puerto Rican gallery, but also open to all of Latin American artists. And in so doing, I think maybe people didn't realize that it was actually run by Puerto Ricans. Exit art. Truly, at the end of the century, there was no gallery, I think, more important in terms of showing vanguard art from a variety of perspectives than Exit Art, which was founded by Papo Colo and Jeanette Ingerman. And that's and Papo was a performance artist. This is Superman from 1977. So in conclusion, and also this movement, I think, has birthed some artists that have really gone back to take up the realm of the helm of being activist artists. One of them is Miguel Luciano, who has worked with the late Hiram Aristani. In fact, there's an exhibition that he had just curated with Hiram that is opening, and sadly, Hiram Aristani died about 2 weeks ago and will never live to see it. And it's all about Black joy, the Black joy that he captured in his photographs. And Chilean Rodriguez, who, in my opinion, is very much working in the spirit of this movement. And here she is at the Whitney Museum, where she led a campaign to oust the trustees, Candors, who was whose company made the tear gas that was used in protests in Puerto Rico and in protests for Black Lives Matter, among others. So I would love to hear from you guys if you have questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was a fantastic presentation. I love how you in a way summarize everything about this idea of the año cero. It's like year one that in a way explodes everything. And I like it also because it's a way to think of like 1968 of New York, of the Latino community in New York, which I think is quite amazing. So many narratives have been done about like the revolution that 68 meant for the Western world. And this is like a much more understudied part of the Western world, right? So I think that was quite incredible. And then let me see if we have any questions from the audience. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, do the other panelists have anything? The prior panelists have anything to add?
We have a question about here. We have a question about your thoughts about episodes of anti-Blackness in Puerto Rican communities, and including exhibitions that are about Indigenous heritage and not African heritage that happen at El Museo.
I'm not quite sure. You'd have to be more specific, because I mean, that's a very general question. And so I can't, it's, would the person like to rephrase it, or I'm happy to have a dialogue with.
Sure. Let's see if there's more positions, but I think, yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is a way to precise that question, but I do have a related question to this about the indigenism. I mean, we see in contemporary art, and you might see it also, Jasmine, that a lot of Latinx contemporary artists are taking upon trends of like contemporary retakes of indigenism, right? And rereading, especially like rereadings of like pre-Hispanic visual motives, like sometimes like contextualized, sometimes more decontextualized in a formalist way, you know. And we see that a lot in contemporary art. And in a way, something that your presentation shows and that the research shows is that some of the political approach and rapport with the tradition of the Taíno was very important for this initial moment of the Puerto Rican communities. Do you see any parallels, or what do you see as differences of that?
There's something in the background I'm hearing. Well, I think that the Taíno imagery has been not just in Puerto Rico, I mean, throughout the Caribbean and in Latin America itself, this recovery of the indigenous past is one that I think is recurrent. And it's what an artist does with it that matters and why they're doing it. So for example, like right now here in Brooklyn, we are going through a resurgence of interest in the Lenape. Often now when I go to exhibitions, like at the Brooklyn Museum or at other museums, they will begin by acknowledging that we are on Lenape land. Yes, maybe after a while that might be not be meaningful if it's not carried over with actually asking or having Native people become more part of the process. But for example, I just got a notice that they're actually doing, the Lenape ancestors have actually curated a small exhibition about their history at a museum, at a library in Greenpoint. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. So for me, it's all about what you do with it.
Of course.
It's really, I think that as a people, as Latin people, we have many ancestors. I think ancestor worship is part of our practice and our spirituality. And so as long as it is really serving a purpose of enriching yourself or others or shedding light on something that's been marginalized, I think a lot of artists, young artists, go through that phase and then maybe do work that's maybe more original. But I think that the recurrence of it is part of what we as a people need to ground ourselves and to find where we fit in the world. That's how I've seen it play out in the work of young artists. They're searching for roots because the art world is still not diverse enough that they can step right in and feel comfortable.
Absolutely.
I mean, there is some anti-Blackness. What I find very interesting is that on the one hand, there's anti-Blackness that persists, but it's being eroded slowly. I think the more that we talk about it, I don't want an overcorrection, which sometimes happens, that I've seen people be accused of being anti-Black because they are interested in exploring their Taino roots. I think that's also has to be questioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also feel, if I can say something very generic, that I felt has been surrounding a lot of these panels and specifically this discussion. I feel it's so unfair that most of the political pressure of correctness lands on the people that have the less opportunity for representation.
Yeah.
Right? It's always, the effort that one has to put to make an exhibition that simply includes names like, Carlos Irrizary, just to include them and to try to give voice to experts like Melissa, I'm not an expert, none of us is an expert, or and the opposition that you find from the system to try to make that happen. And then, the political, pressure and burden that lands upon those of us that are trying to just give a space and open a discussion and to these artists, So I wish that pressure was put first on larger institutions, the white male straight artists that usually.
I think right now with more organizations opening, like the Latinx Project, like the resurgence at Clemente Soto Vélez, which I really hope people give some support to, go up to Tayel, which has a wonderful exhibition now about their own history. I have some hope that things are improving and that this awareness, I think the awareness of anti-Blackness in our community, which I often, which I think that Puerto Rican artists in particular, have been very, have led the way on, even if you can say, well, the Puerto Rican population hasn't followed through, but certainly in the art world that we created here, especially, for example, Marta Moreno Vega was a very early proponent and of exploring our African roots. And now in Puerto Rico, she has a beautiful new space called Casa Africa. And Awilda Sterling from Puerto Rico is about to exhibit at the Whitney Museum. Awilda's she's probably over 70 years old, and is really one of the voices for Afro-Puerto Rican expression. One of the pioneers on the island. Because it has been true that some of the proponents have been white in the beginning. We see that in Cuban art in the 1920s, where there's Afro-Cubism, but there's no real African artists of African descent. So now we have actual people who are of African descent doing their thing, and they're doing it at the Whitney, and we are embracing it. And I think that this movement has really helped to shed a light on that, even as it's had, I think it hasn't been as good in terms of gender equity, let's say.
Yes.
Gender equity. I mean, definitely this group of artists was a very male-dominated group of artists in the 1960s and 70s.
I have another question by Abigail Apen Dardashti. She says, Jasmine, thanks for the wonderful talk. I appreciated your comment about the class difference between some of the Latin American artists temporarily living in New York and Puerto Rican artists and activists. I was wondering if you knew of any exchanges between them.
Sure. I read a paper of hers with the Brazilian artists, and yeah, absolutely. I mean, Caiman, every month, Caiman Gallery was a gathering place for Puerto Rican artists and Latin American artists. I mean, Juan Sanchez regards, oh my God, I'm gonna forget the artist Juan Sanchez and famous Cuban performance artist who died, Ana Mendieta. I mean, he forged a very deep friendship with Ana Mendieta via places like Caiman Gallery. So, I mean, there's many, many instances. I think the history of Caiman Gallery Mocha really needs to be explored more fully than it has, but definitely.
Yeah, and that's something that, I mean, just to share with other people, if you allow me, Jasmine and I had discussed this over the phone and in person extensively. And it's definitely one of the most contentious points that we encounter when making the exhibition. If you don't mind, Jasmine, I will share with the audience that it's something that we obviously encounter and discuss a lot internally with our curatorial team when we were working around the exhibition, and something that I encountered like in the years in which I was doing the research is a huge gap that needed to be more documented and more studied. And I didn't have the opportunity or the time because my research and my dissertation ended up, which is much smaller than the exhibition, ended up having to be focused on only 8 artists. But this is something that needs to be more studied, and we hope that the exhibition serves for that. For example, when we had the opening event, Marcos Dimas said oh yeah, I remember going to exhibitions of the New York Graphic Workshop and hearing Liliana talk, and we did this common event. And Nitza Tufino talked about and sent this documentation of the actions that Taller Boricua did to denounce the assassination of Osvaldo Letelier, the Chilean ambassador that was a refugee in Washington and that was killed in American soil as part of an operation of the Chilean dictatorship with collaboration of American CIA agents. So those kind of instances are, shown not only of political solidarity, but also of these artistic connections between these groups. And that doesn't mean that the class difference didn't exist there. It just means that there were more connections that we know, and, And also, if I can expand on that with regards to Ari's presentation with Eduardo Costa earlier today, she emphasized of Eduardo Costa's names of friends, and she emphasized on her American friends through the poetry groups. But it is very important to also understand that Eduardo Costa was also, that's her research, but he was also in touch with a lot of Latin American artists through networks of creative and political actions. So a lot of these artists had this double entendre and this double location in between some international, like if you like more mainstream avant-garde scene at the same time that they had activities and agency with very Latino communities.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've talked too much. Sorry, please.
No, it's. I mean, what I can just say in terms of this movement is that this movement was also occurring during a time when urban renewal is happening. People, and it's happening without any real funding. I mean, these artists basically lived by grants, and through sweat equity. That's where the class difference, I think, has made an impact in their ability to straddle 2 or 3 different worlds. And I think maybe Latin American artists who may not feel that they have to, you know, when they get here, that they have to speak for the community, that, you know, it's their job to dream up ways in which in their studio can serve as a community center or take care of kids and all of this kind of stuff. You know, Taller Boricua and these other spaces are really they're not just art world spaces. They really are spaces that desire to serve a varied constituency. And so the objectives are a little different. You know, they're good in and of themselves for what they do. And artists now who want basically to have a career as artists and are not doing this community work, not everyone has to do it. I think that I have seen more openings for that to occur as well. So again, this movement had some particular goals that were not related to being successful in the art world. It was really about something else.
Yeah, I want to add to the discussion a comment by Melissa Ramos Borges, a very important reminder. Thank you, Melissa, for bringing this up. The Bienal de San Juan was also a great meeting place for Latin American artists in New York, Latin American artists in Latin America, and Puerto Rican artists.
Where?
Right? The Bienal de San Juan, the San Juan Biennial.
Oh, you're talking about Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Definitely.
So that's a very important point. And I think, and she is also reminding us that this all relates to the dichotomy in the way that we read these artists that Carmen Ramos mentioned yesterday, in terms of like how we read, you know, the political work as conceptual or the conceptual work as political, and how, like, traditionally, depending on the reading system we are part of, whether if we are in the museum or in the community-based, you know, or sociological framework of a study, we tend to emphasize reading the same work that could be, you know, a work that could be read as community-based and identity-based as conceptual, you know, when we could actually be reading it the other way around. I think, you know, again, Annie's presentation today about Eduardo Costa is a great example of that, you know, because Eduardo Costa's work can certainly be read the same way as part of the conceptualist, poetic, formalist tradition, as it could be read as part of a community-based, identity, affect-infused, conceptual situation of a migrant artist in New York. And that's what we're trying to demonstrate.
I think that it's really important to see it both. I think that at that time, it was a little harder for them. Like, so for example, if you talk to artists in the Young Lords, they do not like when I refer to them as artists, because they said we are revolutionaries. You know, we are revolutionaries 24/7. And so they're, even the artists themselves, people who are in the arts, who are artists, but activists, they themselves saw it as a binary. So when I reread them, they often will complain to me that I'm aestheticizing this movement. That was a radical movement. So it goes both ways. I mean, I think it's important to be to read these works, to give them as much multifaceted readings as we can, but also understand that there's limitations, right? There were limitations on these artists. I think that's more the Foucauldian perspective, to really look at, you know, what were the limits of this practice, so that when we read history and we know those limits, how are we going to overcome them now? And I think younger people are more adept at straddling these worlds with technology and also just maneuvering. I think someone like Miguel Luciano is very good, I think, at doing that kind of 2 or 3 different, putting together different audiences, but still maintaining himself in the art world. It's commendable, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. And with that, wonderful reflection about the field, how we approach it, and and how we and the ethics of what we do on art history. Thank you so much, Asmi. I think we can close this wonderful today's symposium.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Shasmi. Thank you so much, everybody. I cannot emphasize and stress to everybody how exciting, important, and beautiful it was to have this gathering. Hopefully a lot more will come from this. I do want to remind everybody that the exhibition is open until May 21st, that on May 4th, we are launching the book, which is going to be an oral history. It's a book also organized, co-published with the help of ISLAA. It's going to be a beautiful book with a lot of first-hand histories about the period by the artists and visual documents, more than 400 pages, please, and it's going to be accessible. And we really want more studies to come from it. And then that on May 10th, we're going to have the screening of the Young Filmmakers Foundation's films organized with Jessica Gordon-Burroughs. And that in May, we're going to have the opening of Elio Itisica's decades-long and never in his lifetime achieved intervention, PN15, which is the environment that he dreamt to do when he moved to New York. We're going to do that at Socrates Sculpture Park, curated by Ches Wilcox, and we are collaborating with the Polit program. So thank you so much, everybody. And please share these presentations and the link with your colleagues and your friends. And you can see any panel that you miss. Everything is uploaded into YouTube. And I hope we can continue this discussion. Bye-bye.